And with the dying of Bedford, what then? Enough of this remarkable phase of my experiences. I tell it here simply to show how one's isolation and departure from this planet touch not only the functions and feeling of every organ of the body, but indeed also the very fabric of the mind, with strange and unanticipated disturbances. All through the major portion of that vast space journey, I hung thinking of such immaterial things as these hung. Dissociated and apathetic, a cloudy megalomaniac as it were, amidst the stars and planets in the void of space. And not only the world to which I was returning, but the blue-lit caverns of the Selenites. The helmet faces the gigantic and wonderful machines, and the fate of Cavil dragged helpless into that world seemed infinitely minute and altogether trivial things to me, until at last I began to feel the pull of the earth upon my being, drawing me back again to the life that is real for men. And then indeed, it grew clearer and clearer to me that I was quite certainly Bedford after all, and returning after amazing adventures to this world of ours, and with the life that I was very likely to lose. In this return I set myself to puzzle out the conditions under which I must fall to earth. Chapter 21. Mr. Bedford at Littlestone. My line of flight was about parallel with the surface. As I came into the upper air, the temperature of the sphere began to rise forthwith. I knew it behold me to drop at once. Far below me in a darkling twilight stretched a great expanse of sea. I opened every window I could and fell out of sunshine into evening, and out of evening into night. Vasta grew the earth, and vasta swallowing up the stars, and the silvery translucent starlit veil of clouded war spread out to catch me. At last the world seemed no longer a sphere, but flat and then concave. It was no longer a planet in the sky, but the world of man. I shut all but an inch or so of earthwood window, and dropped with a slackening velocity, the broadening water now so near that I could see the dark glitter of the waves. Rushed up to meet me, the sphere became very hot. I snapped the last strip of window, and sat scowling and biting my knuckles, waiting for the impact. The sphere hit the water with a huge splash. It must have sent it fathoms high. At the splash I flung the coverite shutters open. Down I went, but slower and slower. And then I felt the sphere pressing against my feet, and so drove up again as a bubble drives, and at the last, I was floating and rocking upon the surface of the sea, and my journey in space was at an end. The night was dark and overcast. 2 yellow pinpoints far away show the passing of a ship. A nearer was a red glare that came and went, had not the electricity of my glow lamp exhausted itself. I could have got picked up that night, in spite of the inordinate fatigue. I was beginning to feel I was excited now over a time, hopeful in a feverish, impatient way that so my traveling might end. But at last, I ceased to move about and sat wrists on knees, staring at a distant red light. It swayed up and down, rocking. My excitement passed. I realized I had yet to spend another night, at least in the sphere. I perceived myself infinitely heavy and fatigued, and so I fell asleep. A change in my rhythmic motion awakened me. I peered through the refracting glass, and saw that I had come aground upon a huge shallow of sand far away. I seemed to see houses and trees, and see what occur. Vague distortion of a ship hung between sea and sky. I stood up and staggered. My one desire was to emerge. The manhole was upward, and I wrestled with the screw. Slowly I opened the manhole. At last, the air was singing in again as once it had sung out. But this time, I did not wait until the pressure was adjusted. In another moment, I had the weight of the window on my hands, and I was open, wide open to the old familiar sky of earth. The air hit me on the chest so that I gasped. I dropped the glass screw. I cried out, put my hands to my chest, and sat down. For a time I was in pain. Then I took deep breaths at last. I could rise and move about again. I tried to thrust my head through the manhole, and the sphere rolled over. It was as though something had lugged my head down. Directly it emerged, I ducked back sharply, or I should have been pinned face underwater. After some wriggling and shoving, I managed to crawl out upon sand, over which the retreating wave still came and went. I did not attempt to stand up. It seemed to me that my body must be suddenly changed to lead. Mother Earth had a grip on me now. No coverite intervening, I sat down, heedless of the water that came over my feet. It was dawn, a gray dawn, rather overcast, but showing here and there. A long patch of greenish gray. Some way out a ship was lying at anchor. A pale silhouette of a ship with one yellow light. The water came rippling in long, shallow waves. Away to the right curved the land. A shingle bank with little hovels, and at last the lighthouse. A sailing mark, and a point inland stretched the space of level sand, broken here and there by pools of water, and ending a mile away, perhaps in a low shore of scrub to the northeast. Some isolated watering place was visible. A row of gaunt lodging houses, the tallest things that I could see on earth. Dull dabs against the brightening sky. What strange men can have reared these vertical piles? In such an amplitude of space, I do not know where they are. Like pieces of Brighton lost in the waste, for a long time I sat there yawning and rubbing my face. At last I struggled to rise. It made me feel that I was lifting a weight. I stood up, I stared at the distant houses, for the first time since our starvation in the crater. I thought of earthly food. Bacon, I whispered. Eggs, good toast, and good coffee. Then, how the devil am I going to get all this stuff to Lim? I wondered where I was. It was in East Shore anyhow. And I had seen Europe before I dropped. I heard footsteps crunching in the sand, and a little round-faced, friendly-looking man in flannels, with a bathing towel wrapped about his shoulders, and his bathing dress over his arm, appeared up the beach. I knew instantly that I must be in England. He was staring most intently at the sphere and me. He advanced staring. I dare say I looked a ferocious savage. Enough dirty unkempt to an undescribable degree, but it did not occur to me at the time. He stopped at a distance of 20 yards. "Hello, my man," he said doubtfully. "Hello yourself," said I. He advanced, reassured by that. "What on earth is that thing?" he asked. "Can you tell me where I am?" I asked. "Well, that's Little Stone," he said, pointing to the houses. "And that's Dungeness if you just landed. What's that thing you've got?" "Sort of machine." "Yes, she floated ashore to be wrecked or something." "What is it?" I meditated swiftly. I made an estimate of the little man's appearance. As he drew near, by Jove, he said, "You've had a time of it. I thought you well. Where were you cast away? Is that thing a sort of floating thing for saving life?" I decided to take that line for the present. I made a few vague affirmatives. "I want help," I said hoarsely. "I want to get some stuff up the beach, stuff I can't very well leave." About I became aware of 3 other pleasant-looking young men with towels, blazers, and straw hats coming down the sands towards me. Evidently, the early bathing section of this Little Stone. "Help," said the young man. Rather, he became vaguely active. "What particularly do you want done?" He turned around and gesticulated. The 3 young men accelerated their pace. In a minute they were about me, plying me with questions I was indisposed to answer. "I'll tell all that later," I said. "I'm deadbeat, I'm a rag. Come up to the hotel," to the foremost little man. "We look after that thing there." I hesitated. "I can't," I said. "In that sphere there's 2 big bars of gold." They looked incredulously at one another, then at me with a new inquiry. I went to the sphere, stooped, crept in, and presently they had the selenites, crowbars, and the broken chain before them. If I had not been so horribly fagged, I could have laughed at them. It was like kittens round a beetle. They didn't know what to do with the stuff. The fat little man stooped and lifted the end of one of the bars, and then dropped it with a grunt. Then they all did. "It's lead or gold," said one. "Oh, it's gold," said another. "Gold, right." "Enough," said the third. Then they all stared at me, and then they all stared at the ship lying at anchor. "I say," cried the little man, "but where did you get that?" I was too tired to keep up a lie. "I got it in the moon." I saw them stare at one another. "Look here," said I, "I'm not going to argue now. Help me carry these lumps of gold up to the hotel. I guess with rests too if you can manage one, and I'll trail this chain thing. And I'll tell you more when I've had some food. And how about that thing? It won't hurt there, I said anyhow. Confirmed it must stop there now. If the tide comes up, it will float all right. And in a state of enormous wonderment, these young men most obediently hoisted my treasures on their shoulders, and with limbs that felt like lead, I headed a sort of procession towards the distant fragment of seafront. Halfway there we were reinforced by two ostrich and little girls with spades, and later, a lean little boy with a penetrating sniff appeared. He was, I remember, wheeling a bicycle, and he accompanied us at a distance of about 100 yards on our right flank, and then, I suppose, gave us up as uninteresting, mounted his bicycle and rode off over the level sands in the direction of the sphere. I glanced back after him. "You won't touch it," said the stout young man reassuringly, and I was only too willing to be reassured. At first, something of the gray of the morning was in my mind, but presently the sun disengaged itself from the level clouds of the horizon and lit the world, and turned the laden sea to glittering waters. My spirits arose. A sense of the vast importance of the things I had done and had yet to do came with the sunlight into my mind. I laughed aloud as the foremost man staggered under my gold. When indeed I took my place in the world, how amazed the world would be if it had not been for my inordinate fatigue. The landlord of the little stone hotel would have been amusing, as he hesitated between my gold and my respectable company on the one and my filthy appearance on the other. But at last, I found myself in a terrestrial bathroom once more, with warm water to wash myself with, and a change of raiment preposterously small indeed, but anyhow clean, that the genie little man had lent me. He lent me a razor too, but I could not screw up my resolution to attack even the outpost of the bristling beer that covered my face. I sat down to an English breakfast and ate with a sort of language appetite, an appetite many weeks old and very decrepit, and stirred myself to answer the questions of the four young men, and I told them the truth. "Well," said I, "as you press me, I got it in the moon." "The moon, yes, the moon in the sky." "How do you mean what I say, confound it? Can you just come from the moon, exactly through space in that bowl?" And I took a delicious mouthful of egg. I made a private note that when I went back to the moon, I would take a box of eggs. I could see clearly that they did not believe one word what I told them, but evidently they considered me the most respectable liar they had ever met. They glanced at one another and then concentrated the fire of their eyes on me. I fancy they expected a clue to me in the way I helped myself to salt. They seemed to find something significant in my peppering my egg, these strangely shaped masses of gold. They had staggered under, held their minds there. The lumps lay in front of me, each worth thousands of pounds, and it's impossible for anyone to steal, as a house or a piece of land. As I looked at their curious faces over my coffee cup, I realized something of the enormous wilderness of explanations into which I should have to wander to render myself comprehensible again. "You don't really mean," began the youngest young man, in the tone of one who speaks to an obsolete child. "Just pass me that toast rack," I said, and shut him up completely. "But look here, I say," began one of the others. "We're not gonna believe that. You know." "Oh well," should I shrug my shoulders. "He doesn't want to tell us," said the young man in a stage aside, and then with an appearance of great song for you. "Don't mind if I take a cigarette." I waved him a cordial assent and proceeded with my breakfast. Two of the others went and looked out of the farther window and talked inaudibly. I was struck by a thought. "The tide," I said, "is running out." It was a pause, a doubt who should answer me. "It's near the ABB," said the fat little man. "Well, anyhow," I said, "it won't float far." I decapitated my third egg and began a little speech. "Look here," I said, "please don't imagine I'm surly or telling you uncivil lies or anything of that sort. I'm forced almost to be a little short and mysterious. I can quite understand this is as clear as it can be. and that your imaginations must be going it. I can assure you you are in at a memorable time. But I can't make it clear to you now. It's impossible, I give you my word of honor. I've come from the moon, and that's all I can tell you. All the same, I'm tremendously obliged to you. You know, tremendously. I hope that my manner hasn't in any way given you offense. Oh, not in the least, said the youngest man affably. We can quite understand. And staring hard at me all the time, he heeled his chair back until it very nearly upset, and recovered with some exertion. Not a bit of it, said the fat young man. Don't you imagine that? And they all got up and dispersed and walked about, and lit cigarettes and generally tried to show they were perfectly amiable and disengaged, and entirely free from the slightest curiosity about me and the sphere. I'm going to keep an eye on that ship. How they're all the same, I had one of them remarking in an undertone. If only they could have forced themselves to it, they would, I believe, even have gone out and left me. I went on with my third egg. The weather, the fat little man remarked presently. It's been immense, has it not? I don't know when we've had such a summer. Fu was like a tremendous rocket, and somewhere a window was broken. What's that, said I. It isn't, cried the little man, and rushed to the corner window. All the others rushed to the window, likewise. I sat staring at them. Suddenly I leapt up, knocked over my third egg, rushed for the window also. I just thought of something. Nothing to be seen there, cried the little man, rushing for the door. It's that boy, I cried, bawling in hoarse fury. It's that accursed boy. And turning about, I pushed the waiter aside. He was just bringing me some more toast, and rushed violently out of the room, and down and out upon the queer little esplanade in front of the hotel. The sea, which had been smooth, was rough now with hurrying cat's paws, and all about where the sphere had been was tumbled water like the wake of a ship above. A little puff of cloud whirled like dispersing smoke, and the 3 or 4 people on the beach was staring up with interrogative faces towards the point of that unexpected report. That was all Boots and waiter, and the 4 young men in blazers came rushing out. Behind me shouts came from windows and doors, and all sorts of worrying people came into sight. Agape for a time I stood there, too overwhelmed by this new development to think of the people. At first I was too stunned to see the thing. As any definite disaster, I was just stunned. As a man is by some accidental, violent blow, it is only afterwards he begins to appreciate his specific injury. Good Lord, I felt as though somebody was pouring funk out of a can down the back of my neck. My legs became feeble. I had got the first information of what the disaster meant. For me, there was that confounded boy sky high. I was utterly left. There was the gold in the coffee room, my only possession on earth. How would it all work out? The general effect was of a gigantic, unmanageable confusion. I say, said the voice of the little man behind. I say, you know. I wheeled about, and there were 20 or 30 people, a sort of irregular investment of people, all bombarding me with dumb interrogation, with infinite doubt and suspicion. I felt the compulsion of their eyes intolerably. I groaned aloud. I can't. I shouted, I tell you, I can't. I'm not equal to it. You must puzzle and be damned to you. I gesticulated convulsively. He receded the step as though I had threatened him. I made a bolt through them into the hotel. I charged back into the coffee room, rang the bell furiously. I gripped the weight as he entered. Do you hear? I shouted. Get help and carry these bars up to my room right away. He failed to understand me, and I shouted and raved at him. A scared-looking little old man in a green apron appeared, and further 2 of the young men in flannels. I made a dash of them and commandeered the services. As soon as the gold was in my room, I felt free to quarrel. Now get out. I shouted, all of you get out, if you don't want to see a man go mad before your eyes. And I helped the waiter by the shoulder as he hesitated in the doorway. And then, as soon as I had the door locked in the mall, I tore off the little man's clothes again, shied them right and left, and got into bed forthwith. And there I lay, swearing and panting and cooling for a very long time. At last I was calm enough to get out of bed and ring up the round-eyed waiter for a flannel, light shirt, a soda and whiskey, and some good cigars. And these things being procured me, after an exasperating delay that drove me several times to the bell, I locked the door again and proceeded very deliberately to look the entire situation in the face. The next result of the great experiment presented itself as an absolute failure. It was a rout, and I was the sole survivor. It was an absolute collapse, and this was the final disaster. There was nothing for it but to save myself, and as much as I could, in the way of prospects from our debacle. But one fatal crowning blow, all my vague resolutions of return and recovery had vanished. My intention of going back to the moon, of getting a sphere full of gold, and afterwards of having a fragment of Kavi to analyze, and so recovering the great secret, perhaps finally even of recovering Kaval's body. All these ideas vanished altogether. That was the sole survivor, and that was all. I think that going to bed was one of the luckiest ideas I have ever had in an emergency. I really believe I should either have got loose-headed or done some indiscreet thing, but they're locked in and secure from all interruptions. I could think out the position and all its bearings, and make my arrangements at leisure, of course. It was quite clear to me what had happened to the boy. He'd crawled into the sphere, meddled with the studs, shut the copyright windows and gone up. It was highly improbable he had screwed the manhole stopper, and even if he had, the chances were 1,000 to 1 against his getting back. It was fairly evident that he would gravitate with my bales to somewhere near the middle of the sphere and remain there, and so cease to be a legitimate terrestrial interest, however remarkable he might seem to the inhabitants of some remote quarter of space. I very speedily convinced myself on that point, and as for any responsibility I might have in the matter, the more I reflected upon that, the clearer it became that if only had kept quiet about things I need not trouble myself about, that if I was faced by sorrowing parents demanding their lost boy, I had merely demand my lost sphere, or ask them what they meant. At first, I had a vision of weeping parents and guardians, and all sorts of complications. But now I saw that I simply had to keep my mouth shut, and nothing in that way could arise. And indeed, the more I lay and smoked and thought, the more evident became the wisdom of impenetrability. It is within the right of every British citizen, provided he does not commit damage nor indecorum, to appear suddenly wherever he pleases, and as ragged and filthy as he pleases, and with whatever amount of virgin gold he sees fit, to encumber himself, and no one has any right at all to hinder, entertain him in this procedure. I formulated that at last to myself, and repeated it over, as a sort of private Magna Carta of my liberty. Once I had put that issue on one side, I could take up and consider in an equable manner certain considerations I had scarcely dared to think of before, namely those arising out of the circumstances of my bankruptcy. But now, looking at this matter calmly and at leisure, I could see that if only I suppressed my identity by a temporary assumption of some less well-known name, and if I retained the 2 months' beard that had grown upon me, the risk of any annoyance from the spiteful creditor, to whom I already alluded, became very small indeed. From that to a definite course of rational, worldly action was plain sailing. It was all amazingly petty, no doubt. But what was there remaining for me to do? Whatever I did, I was resolved that I would keep myself level. And right side up I ordered up writing materials, and addressed the letter to the New Rumney Bank, the nearest the waiter informed me, telling the manager I wished to open an account with him, and requesting him to send to trustworthy persons, properly authenticated in a cab with a good horse, to fetch some 100 weight of gold, with which I happened to be encumbered. I signed the letter Blake, which seemed to me to be a thoroughly respectable sort of name. This done, I got a Folkestone blue book, picked out an outfitter, and asked him to send a cutter to measure me for a dark tweed suit, ordering at the same time a Ollie's dressing bag, brown boots, shirts, hat to fit, and so forth from a watchmaker. I also ordered a watch, and these letters being dispatched, I had up as good a lunch as the hotel could give, and then lay smoking a cigar, as calm and ordinary as possible until, in accordance with my instructions to duly authenticated clerks, came from the bank and weighed and took away my gold, after which I pulled the clothes over my ears, in order to drown any knocking, and went very comfortably to sleep. I went to sleep, no doubt. It was a prosaic thing for the first man back from the moon to do, and I can imagine that the young and imaginative reader will find my behavior disappointing, but I was horribly fatigued and bothered and confounded. What else was there to do? This certainly was not the remotest chance of my being believed. If I told my story then, and it would certainly have subjected me to intolerable annoyances. I went to sleep. When at last I woke up again, I was ready to face the world, as I have always been accosted to face it, since I came to years of discretion, and so I got away to Italy. And there it is, I am writing this story. If the world will not have it as fact, then the world may take it as fiction. It is no concern of mine. And now that the account is finished, I am amazed to think how completely this adventure is gone and done with. Everybody believes that Cavil was a not very brilliant scientific experimenter who blew up his house and himself at Lim, and they explained the bang that followed my arrival at Little Stone by a reference to the experiments with explosives that are going on continually at the government establishment of Lid 2 miles away. I must confess that hitherto I have not acknowledged my share in the disappearance of Master Tommy Simmons, which was that little boy's name. That perhaps may prove a difficult item of corroboration. To explain away they account for my appearance in rags with 2 bars of indisputable gold upon the Little Stone beach in various ingenious ways. It doesn't worry me what they think of me. They say I have strung all these things together to avoid being questioned too closely as to the source of my wealth. I would like to see the man who could invent a story that would hold together like this one. Well, they must take it as fiction. There it is, I have told my story, and now I suppose I have to take up the worries of this terrestrial life again. Even if one has been to the moon, one has still to earn a living, so I am working here to mouthie on the scenario of that play I sketched before Cavil came walking into my world, and I'm trying to piece my life together as it was before ever I saw him. I must confess that I find it hard to keep my mind on the play. When the moonshine comes into my room, it is full moon here, and last night I was out on the pergola for hours, staring away at the shining blackness that hides so much. Imagine it. Tables and chairs and trestles and bars of gold. Found it. If only one could hit on that cover right again. But a thing like that doesn't come twice in a life. Here I am a little better off than I was at Lim. And that is all, and Cavil has committed suicide in a more elaborate way than any human being ever did before. So, the story closes as finely and completely as a dream. It fits in so little with all the other things of life. So much of it is so utterly remote from all human experience, the leaping, the eating, the breathing, and these weightless times, that indeed there are moments when, in spite of my moon gold, I do more than half believe myself that the whole thing was a dream. Chapter 22. The Astonishing Communication of Mr. Julius Wendige. When I had finished my account of my return to Earth at Little Stone, I wrote the end, made a flourish, and threw my pen aside, fully believing that the whole story of the first man in the moon was done. Not only had I done this, but I had placed my manuscript in the hands of a literary agent, had permitted it to be sold, had seen the greater portion of it appear in the Strand of magazine, and was setting to work again upon the scenario of the play I had commenced at Lim, before I realized that the end was not yet. And then following me from Amalfi to Algiers, they reached me just now about 6 months ago. One of the most astounding communications I have ever been fated to receive. Briefly, it informed me that Mr. Julius Wendige, a Dutch electrician, who has been experimenting with certain apparatus, akin to the apparatus used by Mr. Tesla in America in the hope of discovering some method of communication with Mars, was receiving day by day a curiously fragmentary message in English, which was indisputably emanating from Mr. Cavill in the moon. But first I thought the thing was an elaborate, practical joke by someone who had seen the manuscript of my narrative. I answered Mr. Wendige jestingly, but he replied, in a manner that put such suspicion altogether aside, and in a state of inconceivable excitement, I hurried from Algeria to the little observatory upon the Monte Rosso in which he was working, in the presence of his record and his appliances, and above all, of the messages from Cavill that were coming to hand. My lingering doubts vanished. I decided at once to accept a proposal he made to me, to remain with him, assisting him to take down the record from day to day, and endeavoring with him to send a message back to the moon. Cavill, we learned, was not only alive but free, in the midst of an almost inconceivable community of these ant-like beings, these ant-men in the blue darkness of the lunar caves. He was lamed, it seemed, but otherwise in quite good health. In better health, he distinctly said, than he usually enjoyed on Earth. He had had a fever, but it had left no bad effects. But curiously enough, he seemed to be laboring under a conviction that I was either dead in the moon crater or lost in the deep of space. His message began to be received by Mr. Wendige when that gentleman was engaged in quite a different investigation. The reader will no doubt recall the little excitement that began the century, arising out of an announcement by Mr. Nikola Tesla, the American electrical celebrity, that he had received a message from Mars. His announcement renewed attention to fact that had long been familiar to scientific people, namely that from some unknown source in space, waves of electromagnetic disturbance, entirely similar to those used by Senior Marconi for his wireless telegraphy, are constantly reaching the Earth. Besides Tesla, quite a number of other observers have been engaged in perfecting apparatus for receiving and recording these vibrations, though few would go so far to consider them actual messages from some extraterrestrial sender. Among that few, however, we must certainly count Mr. Wendige. Ever since 1898, he had devoted himself almost entirely to this subject, and being a man of ample means, he had erected an observatory on the flanks of Monte Rosso in a position singularly adapted in every way for such observations. My scientific attainments, I must admit, are not great, but so far as they enabled me to judge Mr. Wendige's contrivances for detecting and recording any disturbances in the electromagnetic conditions of space are singularly original and ingenious, and by a happy combination of circumstances, they were set up and in operation about 2 months before Cavill made his first attempt to call up the Earth. Consequently, we have fragments of this communication, even from the beginning, and happily they are only fragments, and the most momentous of all, the things that he had to tell humanity, the instructions, that is, for the making of Catharite, if indeed he ever transmitted them, have throbbed themselves away unrecorded into space. We never succeeded in getting a response back to Cavill. He was unable to tell, therefore, what we had received or what we had missed, nor indeed did he certainly know what anyone on Earth was really aware of his efforts to reach us, and the persistence he displayed in sending 18 long descriptions of lunar affairs, as they would be if we had them complete, shows how much his mind must have turned back towards his native planet since he left it 2 years ago. You can imagine how amazed Mr. Wendige must have been when he discovered his record of electromagnetic disturbances interlaced by Cavill's straightforward English. Mr. Wendige knew nothing of our wild journey moonward, and suddenly this English out of the void it is. Well, the reader should understand the conditions under which it would seem these messages were sent somewhere within the moon. Kavil certainly had access, for a time, to a considerable amount of electrical apparatus, and it would seem he rigged up, perhaps furtively, a transmitting arrangement of the Marconi type. This he was able to operate at irregular intervals, sometimes for only half an hour or so, sometimes for 3 or 4 hours at a stretch. At these times he transmitted his earthward message, regardless of the fact that the relative position of the moon and points upon the Earth's surface is constantly altering. That's a consequence of this and of the necessary imperfections of our recording instruments. His communication comes and goes in our records. In an extremely fitful manner, it becomes blurred, it fades out, in a mysterious and altogether exasperating way. And added to this is the fact that he was not an expert operator. He had partly forgotten, whenever completely mastered the code in general use. And as he became fatigued, he dropped words and misspelled in a curious manner. Altogether, we have probably lost quite half of the communications he made, and much we have is damaged, broken, and partly effaced in the abstract that follows. The reader must be prepared, therefore, for a considerable amount of break, hiatus, and change of topic. Mr. Wendige and I are collaborating in a complete and annotated edition of the Kavil record, which we hope to publish together, with a detailed account of the instruments employed, beginning with the first volume in January. Next, that will be the full and scientific report, of which this is only the popular transcript, but here we give at least sufficient to complete the story I have told, and to give the broad outlines of the state of that other world, so near, so akin, and yet so dissimilar to our own. Chapter 23, an abstract of the 6 messages first received from Mr. Kavil. The 2 earlier messages of Mr. Kavil may very well be reserved for that larger volume. They simply tell with greater brevity, and with a difference in several details. That is interesting, but not of any vital importance. The bare fact of the making of the sphere and our departure from the world. Throughout, Kabul speaks of me as a man who is dead, but with a curious change of temper as he approaches our landing on the moon. Poor Bedford, he says of me, and this poor young man, and he blames himself for inducing a young man, by no means well equipped for such adventures, to leave a planet on which he was indisputably fitted to succeed. On so precarious a mission, I think he underrates the part my energy and practical capacity played in bringing about the realization of his theoretical sphere. We arrived, he says, with no more account of our passage through space than if we had made a journey of common occurrence in a railway train, and then he becomes increasingly unfair to me. Unfair indeed, to an extent I should not have expected. In a man trained in the search for truth, looking back over my previously written account of these things, I must insist that I have been altogether just at the cavil than he has been to me. I've extenuated little and suppressed nothing. But his account is, it speedily became apparent that the entire strangeness of our circumstances and surroundings, great loss of weight, attenuated but highly oxygenated air, consequent exaggeration of the results of muscular effort, rapid development of weird plants from obscure spores, lurid sky was exciting my companion unduly on the moon. His character seemed to deteriorate. He became impulsive, rash, and quarrelsome in a little while. His folly in devouring some gigantic vesicles, and his consequent intoxication, led to our capture by the Selenites, before we had the slightest opportunity of properly observing their ways. He says you observe nothing of his own concession to these same vesicles, and he goes on from that point to say that we came to a difficult passage with them, and Bedford, mistaking certain gestures of theirs, pretty gestures they were, gave way to a panic violence. He ran amok, killed 3, and before I had to flee with him after the outrage, subsequently, we fought with a number who endeavored to bar away, and slew 7 or 8 more. It says much for the tolerance of these beings that, on my recapture, I was not instantly slain. We made our way to the exterior, and separated in the crater of our arrival, to increase our chances of recovering our sphere. But presently I came upon a body of selenites, led by two who are curiously different, even in form from any of these we had seen here. The two with larger heads and smaller bodies, and much more elaborately wrapped about. And after evading them for some time, I fell into a crevice, cut my head rather badly and displaced my patella, and finding crawling very painful, decided to surrender. If they would still permit me to do so. This they did, and perceiving my helpless condition, carried me with them again into the moon, and of Bedford I have heard or seen nothing more, nor so far as I can gather, any selenite, either the night overtook him in the crater or else, which is more probable he found the sphere and, desiring to steal a march upon me, made off with it only, I fear to find it uncontrollable, and to meet a more lingering fate in outer space. And with that cavil dismisses me, and goes on to more interesting topics. I dislike the idea of seeming to use my position as his editor to deflect his story in my own interest, but I'm obliged to protest here against the attorney. Gives these occurrences, he said nothing about. That gasping message on the blood-stained paper, in which he told, or attempted to tell a very different story. The dignified self-surrender is an altogether new view of the affair. That has come to him, I must insist, since he began to feel secure among the lunar people. And as for the stealing a march conception, I am quite willing to let the reader decide between us. On what he is before him, I know I am not a model man. I have made no pretense to be, but am I that? However, that is the sum of my wrongs from this point. I can edit cavil with an untroubled mind, for he mentions me no more. It would seem the selenites would come upon him, carried him to some point in the interior, down a great shaft, by means of what he describes as a sort of balloon. We gather from the rather confused passage in which he describes this, and from a number of chance allusions, and hints in other and subsequent messages, that this great shaft is one of an enormous system of artificial shafts that run each from what is called a lunar crater, downwards for very nearly 100 miles. Towards the central portion of our satellite, these shafts communicate by transverse tunnels. They throw out abysmal caverns and expand into great, globular places. The whole of the moon's substance for 100 miles inward, indeed, is a mere sponge of rock. Partly, says Cavall, this sponginess is natural, but very largely it is due to the enormous industry of the selenites. In the past, the enormous, circular mounds of the excavated rock and earth is that form these great circles about the tunnels, known to earthly astronomers, misled by a false analogy as volcanoes. It was down this shaft they took him. In this sort of balloon he speaks of, at first into an inky blackness, and then into a region of continually increasing phosphorescence. Cavill's dispatches show him to be curiously, regardless of detail for scientific man, but we gather that this light was due to the streams and cascades of water, no doubt containing some phosphorescent organism, that flowed ever more abundantly downward towards the central sea. And as he descended, he says, the selenites also became luminous, and at last far below him he saw, as it were, a lake of heatless fire, the waters of the central sea glowing and adding in strange perturbation, like luminous blue milk that is just on the boil. This lunar sea, says Cavil in a later passage, is not a stagnant ocean. A solar tide sends it in a perpetual flow around the lunar axis, and strange storms and boilings and rushings of its waters occur, and at times cold winds and thunderings that ascend out of it into the busy ways of the great, until above. It is only when the water is in motion that it gives out light in its rare seasons of calm. It is black. Commonly, when one sees it, its waters rise and fall in an oily swell, and flakes and big rafts of shining, bubbly foam drift with the sluggish, faintly glowing current. The selenites navigate its cavernous straits and lagoons in little, shallow boats of a canoe-like shape. And even before my journey to the galleries, about the grand lunar who is master of the moon, I was permitted to make a brief excursion on its waters. The caverns and passages are naturally very tortuous. A large portion of these ways are known only to expert pilots, among the fishermen, and not infrequently selenites are lost forever in their labyrinth. In their remote recesses, I am told strange creatures lurk, some of them terrible and dangerous. Creatures that all the signs of the moon has been unable to exterminate. There is particularly the Rapha, an inextricable mass of clutching tentacles that one hacks to pieces only to multiply. And that's a darting creature that is never seen, so subtly and suddenly does it slay. He gives us a gleam of description. I was reminded on this excursion of what I have read of the Mammoth Caves. If only I had a yellow flambeau instead of the pervading blue light, and a solid-looking boatman with an oar instead of a scuttle-faced selenite working an engine at the back of the canoe, I could have imagined I had suddenly got back to Earth. The rocks about us were very various, sometimes black, sometimes pale blue, and veined, and once they flashed and glittered, as though we had come into a mine of sapphires, and below one saw the ghostly, phosphorescent fishes flash and vanish in the hardly less phosphorescent deep. Then presently a long ultramarine vista, down the turgid stream of one of the channels of traffic, and a landing stage, and then perhaps a glimpse up the enormous, crowded shaft of one of the vertical ways, in one great place heavy with glistening stalactites. A number of boats were fishing. We went along one of these, and watched the long-armed selenites winding in a net. They were little, hunchbacked insects with very strong arms, short bandy legs, and crinkled face masks as they pulled at it. That net seemed the heaviest thing I'd come upon. In the moon it was loaded with weights, no doubt of gold, and it took a long time to draw for in those waters. The larger and more edible fish looked deep. The fish in the net came up like a blue moonrise, a blaze of darting, tossing blue. Among the catch was a many-tentaculate, evil-eyed black thing ferociously active, whose appearance they greeted with shrieks and twitters, and which with quick nervous movements they hacked to pieces by means of little hatchets. All its discovered limbs continued to lash and ride in a vicious manner. Afterwards, when fever had hold of me, I dreamt again and again of that bitter, furious creature rising, so vigorous and active out of the unknown sea. It was the most active and malignant thing of all the living creatures I have yet seen in this world inside the moon. The surface of this sea must be very nearly 200 miles, if not more, below the level of the moon's exterior. All the cities of the moon lie, I learned, immediately above this central sea, in such cavernous spaces and artificial galleries as I have described, and they communicate with the exterior by enormous, vertical shafts which open, invariably in what are called by earthly astronomers the craters of the moon. The lid covering one such aperture I'd already seen during the wanderings that had preceded my capture upon the condition of the less central portion of the moon. I have not yet arrived at very precise knowledge. There's an enormous system of caverns in which the moon carves shelter during the night, and there are abattoirs and the like. In one of these it was that I in Bedford fought with the selenite butchers, and I have since seen balloons laden with meat descending out of the upper dark. I have as yet scarcely learnt as much of these things as a Zulu in London would learn about the British corn supplies. In the same time, it is clear, however, that these vertical shafts and the vegetation of the surface must play an essential role in ventilating and keeping fresh the atmosphere of the moon at one time, and particularly on my first emergence from my prison. There was certainly a cold wind blowing down the shaft, and later there was a kind of Morocco upward that corresponded with my fever for the end of about 3 weeks. I fell ill of an indefinable sort of fever and in spite of sleep and the Queen tabloids that, very fortunately, I had brought in my pocket, I remained ill and fretting miserably, almost to the time when I was taken into the presence of the grand lunar who is master of the moon. I will not dilate on the wretchedness of my condition, he remarks during those days of ill health. And he goes on with great amplitude with details. I am at here. My temperature, he concludes, kept abnormally high for a long time, and I lost all desire for food. I had stagnant waking intervals and sleep, tormented by dreams, and at one phase I remember, so weak as to be earth-sick and almost hysterical. I longed almost intolerably for color to break. The everlasting blue. He reverts again presently to the topic of this sponge-court lunar atmosphere. I am told by astronomers and physicists that all he tells is in absolute accordance with what was already known of the moon's condition. Had earthly astronomers had the courage and imagination to push home a bold induction, says Mr. Wendigee, they might have foretold almost everything that Cavell has to say of the general structure of the moon. They know now pretty certainly that moon and earth are not so much satellite and primary as smaller and greater sisters made of one mass, and consequently made out of the same material. And since the density of the moon is only 3/5 that of the earth, there can be nothing for it but that she is hollowed out by a great system of caverns. There was no necessity, said Sir J.B.'s Flap FRS, that most entertaining exponent of the facetious side of the stars, that we should have ever gone to the moon to find out such easy inferences, and points the pun with an allusion to gray air. But he certainly might have announced his knowledge of the hollowness of the moon before. And if the moon is hollow, then the apparent absence of air and water is, of course, quite easily explained. The sea lies within at the bottom of the caverns, and the air travels through the great sponge of galleries in accordance with simple physical laws. The caverns of the moon on the whole are very windy places. As the sunlight comes round the moon, the air in the outer galleries on that side is heated. Its pressure increases some, flows out on the exterior, and mingles with the evaporating air of the craters, where the plants remove its carbonic acid, while the greater portion flows round through the galleries to replace the shrinking air of the cooling side that the sunlight has left. There is therefore a constant eastward breeze in the air of the outer galleries, and an upflow during the lunar day up the shafts, complicated, of course, very greatly by the varying shape of the galleries and the ingenious contrivances of the Selenite mind. Chapter 24, The Natural History of the Selenites. The messages of Cavell from the 6th up to the 16th are for the most part so much broken, and they are bound so in repetitions, that they scarcely form a consecutive narrative. They will be given in full, of course, in the scientific report, but here it will be far more convenient to continue simply to abstract and quote, as in the former chapter. We have subjected every word to a keen, critical scrutiny, and my own brief memories and impressions of lunar things have been of inestimable help in interpreting what would otherwise have been impenetrably dark. And naturally, as living beings, our interest centers far more upon the strange community of lunar insects, in which he was living, it would seem, as an honored guest, than upon the mere physical condition of their world. I have already made it clear, I think, that the Selenites I saw resembled man in maintaining the erect attitude and in having for limbs, and I've compared the general appearance of their heads and the jointing of their limbs to that of insects. I have mentioned, too, the peculiar consequence of the smaller gravitation of the moon on their fragile slightness. Cavell confirms me upon all these points. He calls them animals, though of course they fall under no division of the classification of earthly creatures, and he points out the insect type of anatomy had, fortunately for men, never exceeded a relatively very small size on Earth. The largest terrestrial insects living or extinct, do not. As a matter of fact, measure 6 inches in length. But here against the lesser gravitation of the moon, a creature certainly as much an insect as vertebrate seems to have been able to attain to human and ultra-human dimensions. He does not mention the ant, but throughout his illusions, the ant is continually being brought before my mind. In its sleepless activity, in its intelligence and social organization, in its structure, and more particularly in the fact that it displays, in addition to the 2 forms, the male and the female form, that almost all other animals possess a number of other sexless creatures, workers, soldiers and the like, differing from one another in structure, character, power, and use, and yet all members of the same species. For these selenites also have a great variety of forms. Of course, they are not only colossally greater in size than ants, but also, in Cavill's opinion at least, in intelligence, morality, and social wisdom. Are they colossally greater than men? And instead of the 4 or 5 different forms of ant that are found, there are almost innumerably different forms. O.F. selenite, I had endeavored to indicate the very considerable difference observable in such selenites of the outer crust, as I happened to encounter. The differences in size and proportions were certainly as wide as the differences between the most widely separated races of men. But such differences as I saw fade absolutely to nothing in comparison with the huge distinctions of which Cavill tells it would seem. The exterior selenites I saw were indeed mostly engaged in kindred occupations, moon calf herds, butchers, fleshes, and alike. But within the moon, practically unsuspected by me, there are, it seems, a number of other sorts of selenite differing in size, differing in the relative size of part to part, differing in power and appearance, and yet not different species of creatures, but only different forms of one species, and retaining through all their variations a certain common likeness that marks their specific unity. The moon is indeed a sort of vast until only, instead of there being only 4 or 5 sorts of ant, there are many hundred different sorts of selenite, and almost every gradation between one sort and another. It would seem the discovery came upon Cavill very speedily. I infer rather than learn from his narrative that he was captured by the moon calf herds under the direction of these other selenites who have larger brain cases, heads, and very much shorter legs. Finding he would not walk even under the goat, they carry him into darkness, crossed a narrow plank-like bridge that may have been identical bridge I had refused, and put him down in something that must have seemed at first to be some sort of lift. This was the balloon. It had certainly been absolutely invisible to us in the darkness, and what had seemed to me a mere plank walking into the void was really, no doubt, the passage of the gangway. In this he descended towards constantly more luminous caverns of the moon. At first they descended in silence, save for the twitterings of the selenites, and then into a stir of windy movement. In a little while, the profound blackness had made his eyes so sensitive that he began to see more and more of the things about him, and at last the vague took shape. Conceive an enormous cylindrical space, says Cavill in his 7th message, a quarter of a mile across, perhaps very dimly lit at first and then brighter, with big platforms twisting down its side in a spiral that vanishes at last below in a blue profundity, and lit even more brightly. One could not tell how or why. Think of the well of the very largest spiral staircase or lift shaft that you have ever looked down, and magnify that by 100. Imagine it at twilight seen through blue glass. Imagine yourself looking down that. Only imagine also that you feel extraordinarily light. And I've got rid of any giddy feeling you might have on Earth, and you will have the first conditions of my impression. Round this enormous shaft, imagine a broad gallery, running in a much steeper spiral, then would be credible on Earth and forming a steep road, protected from the Gulf only by a little parapet, that vanishes at last in perspective, a couple of miles below. Looking up, I saw the very fellow of the downward vision. It had, of course, the effect of looking into a very steep cone. A wind was blowing down the shaft, and far above, I fancy, I heard growing fainter and fainter the bellowing of the moon calves that were being driven down, again from their evening pasturage on the exterior, and up and down the spiral galleries were scattered numerous moon people, pallid, faintly luminous beings regarding our appearance, or busy on unknown errands. Either I fancied it, or a flake of snow came drifting down on the icy breeze, and then falling like a snowflake, a little figure, a little man insect clinging to a parachute, drove down very swiftly towards the central places of the moon. The big-headed selenite sitting beside me, seeing me move my head with the gesture of one who saw, pointed with his trunk-like hand and indicated a sort of jetty coming into sight very far below, little landing stage, as it were, hanging into the void as it swept up towards us. Our pace diminished very rapidly, and in a few moments, as it seemed, we were oppressed a bit, and at rest a mooring rope was flung and grasped, and I found myself pulled down to a level with a great crowd of selenites who jostled to see me. It was an incredible crowd. Suddenly and violently there was forced upon my attention the vast amount of difference there is amongst these beings of the moon. Indeed, this seems not to alike in all that jostling multitude. They differed in shape, they differed in size, they rang all the horrible changes. On the theme of selenite form, some balls turned over hung. Some ran about among the feet of their fellows. All of them had a grotesque and disquieting suggestion of an insect that has somehow contrived to mock humanity, but all seemed to present an incredible exaggeration of some particular feature. One had a vast right for limb, an enormous antennal arm, as it were. One seemed all leg poised, as it were, on stilts. Another protruded the edge of his face mask into a nose-like organ that made him startlingly human, until one saw his expressionless, gaping mouth, the strange, and except for the want of mandibles and palps, most insect-like head of the moon calf miners underwent. Indeed, the most incredible transformations. Here it was broad and low, here high and narrow here. Its leathery brow was drawn out into horns and strange features. Here it was whisked and divided, and there with a grotesquely human profile. One distortion was particularly conspicuous. There were several brain cases, distended like bladders to a huge size, with the face mask reduced to quite small proportions. There were several amazing forms, with heads reduced to microscopic proportions, and blobby bodies, the fantastic flimsy things that existed, it would seem, only as a basis for vast, trumpet like protrusions of the lower part of the mosque. And oddest of all, as it seemed to me for the moment, 2 or 3 of these weird inhabitants of a subterranean world, a world sheltered by innumerable miles of rock from sun or rain, carried umbrellas in their tentaculate hands, real terrestrial-looking umbrellas. And then I thought of the parachutist I'd watched descend. These moon people behaved exactly as a human crowd might have done. In similar circumstances, they jostled and thrust one another. They shoved one another aside. They even climbed upon one another to get a glimpse of me. Every moment they increased in numbers and pressed more urgently upon the discs of my ashes. Cavell does not explain what he means by this. Every moment fresh shapes emerged from the shadows and forced themselves upon my astounded attention, and presently I was signed and helped into a sort of litter, and lifted up on the shoulders of strong armed bearers. I'm so borne through the twilight, over this seething multitude, towards the apartments that were provided for me. In the moon, all about me were eyes, faces, masks a leathery noise, like the rustling of beetle wings and a great bleating, and cricket-like twittering of selenite voices. We gather he was taken to a hexagonal apartment, and there for a space he was confined. Afterwards, he was given a much more considerable liberty, indeed almost as much freedom as one has in a civilized town on earth. And it would appear that the mysterious being, who is the ruler and master of the moon, appointed to selenite with large heads to guard and study him and to establish whatever mental communications were possible with him, and amazing and incredible as it may seem. These two creatures, these fantastic men-insects, these beings of other world, were presently communicating with Cavil by means of terrestrial speech. Cavil speaks of them as Fiu and Sci-Puff. Fiu, he says, was about 5 feet high. He had small, slender legs about 18 inches long, and slight feet of the common lunar pattern. On these balanced the little body, throbbing with the pulsations of his heart. He had long, soft, many-jointed arms ending in a tentacle grip, and his neck was many-jointed in the usual way, but exceptionally short and thick. His head, says Cavil, apparently alluding to some previous description that has gone astray in space, is of the common lunar type, but strangely modified. The mouth has the usual expression escape, but it is unusually small and pointing downward, and the mask is reduced to the size of a large, flat nose flap. On either side are the little eyes. The rest of the head is descended into a huge globe, and the chitinous, leathery cuticle of the moon cough herds thins out to a mere membrane through which the pulsating brain movements are distinctly visible. He is a creature indeed, with a tremendously hypertrophy brain, and with the rest of his organism, both relatively and absolutely dwarfed in another passage. Cavil compares the back view of him to Atlas supporting the world. Sci-Puff, it seems, was a very similar insect, but his face was drawn out to a considerable length, and the brain hypertrophy being in different regions. His head was not round, but pear-shaped with the stalk downward. There were also litter carriers, lopsided beings with enormous shoulders, very spidery ushers, and a squat foot attendant in cavalry's retinue. The manner in which Fiu and Sci-Puff attack the problem of speech was fairly obvious. They came into this hexagonal cell in which Cavil was confined, and began imitating every sound he made, beginning with a cough. He seems to have grasped their intention with great quickness, and have begun repeating words to them, and pointing to indicate the application. The procedure was probably always the same. Fiu would attend to Cavil for a space, then point also and say the word he had heard. The first word he mastered was man, and the second Mooney, which cover on the spur of the moment seems to have used instead of selenite for the moon race. As soon as Fiu was assured of the meaning of a word, he repeated it to Sci-Puff, who remembered it infallibly. They mastered over 100 English names of their first session. Subsequently, it seems, they brought an artist with them to assist the work of explanation with sketches and diagrams. Cavil's drawings being rather crude, he was, says Cavil, a being with an active arm and an arresting eye, and he seemed to draw with incredible swiftness. The 11th message is undoubtedly only a fragment of a longer communication, after some broken sentences, the record of which is unintelligible. It goes on, but it will interest only linguists, and delay me too long to give the details of the series of intent parties, of which these were the beginning, and indeed, I very much doubt if I could give in anything like the proper order of the twistings and turnings that we made. In our pursuit of mutual comprehension, verbs were soon plain sailing, at least such active verbs as I could express by drawings. Some adjectives were easy, but when it came to abstract nouns, to propositions, and the sort of hackneyed figures of speech, by means of which so much is expressed on earth. It was like diving in cork jackets. Indeed, these difficulties were insurmountable, until to the sixth lesson came a fourth assistant, a being with a huge football-shaped head, whose forte was clearly the pursuit of intricate analogy. He entered in a preoccupied manner, stumbling against the stool and the difficulties that arose had to be presented to him with a certain amount of clamor and hitting and pricking before they reached his apprehension. But once he was involved, his penetration was amazing. Whenever there came a need of thinking beyond Fire's by no means limited scope, this prolate-headed person was in request. But he invariably told the conclusion to Sci-Fi, in order that it might be remembered. Sci-Fi was ever the arsenal for facts. And so we advanced again. It seemed long and yet brief, a matter of days before I was positively talking with these insects. Of the moon, of course, at first it was an intercourse, infinitely tedious and exasperating, but imperceptibly it has grown to comprehension, and my patience has grown to meet its limitations. By you it is who does all the talking. He does it with a vast amount of meditative provisional hum and has caught up one or two phrases, if I may say, if you understand, and beads all of his speech with them. Thus he would discourse. Imagine him explaining his artist. He, if I may say, draw. Eat little, drink little, draw, love, draw no other thing. Hate all who not draw like him, angry. Hate all who draw like him, better. Hate most people. Hate all who not think all world for to draw, angry. All things mean nothing to him. Only draw he like you, if you understand. New thing to draw. Ugly, striking a he, turning to Sci-Fi, love. Remember words. Remember wonderful more than any think. No draw, no remember say. Here he referred to his gifted assistant for a word. Histories. All things he hear once say ever. It is more wonderful to me than I dreamt that anything ever could be. Again to hear in this perpetual obscurity these extraordinary creatures, for even familiarity fails to weaken the inhuman effect of their appearance, continually piping a nearer approach to coherent earthly speech, asking questions, giving answers. I feel that I am casting back to the fable, hearing period of childhood again, when the ant and the grasshopper talked together, and the bee judged between them. And while these linguistic exercises were going on, Cavil seems to have experienced a considerable relaxation of his confinement. The first dread and distrust, our unfortunate conflict, aroused his being. He said continually, effaced by the deliberate rationality of all I do, I am now able to come and go as I please, or I am restricted only for my own good. So it is I have been able to get at this apparatus, and assisted by a happy find among the material that is littered in this enormous store cave, I have contrived to dispatch these messages. So far not the slightest attempt has been made to interfere with me in this, though I have made it quite clear to Fire you that I am signaling to the earth. You talk to other, he asked, watching me. Others said I, others, he said. Oh yes, men, and I went on transmitting. Cavil was continually making corrections in his previous accounts of the selenite, as fresh facts flowed upon him to modify his conclusions, and accordingly one gives the quotations that follow. With a certain amount of reservation, they are quoted from the 9th, 13th, and 16th messages, and altogether vague and fragmentary as they are, they probably give as complete a picture of the social life of this strange community as mankind can now hope to have for many generations. In the moon, says Cavil, every citizen knows his place. He is born to that place, and the elaborate discipline of training and education and surgery he undergoes fits him at last so completely to it, but he has neither ideas nor organs for any purpose beyond it. Why should he, Fire would ask, if, for example, a selenite is destined to be a mathematician? His teachers and trainers set out at once to that end. They check any incipient disposition to other pursuits. They encourage his mathematical bias. With a perfect psychological skill, his brain grows. Or at least the mathematical faculties of his brain grow, and the rest of him, only so much as is necessary to sustain. This essential part of him, at last safe for rest and food, is one delight lies in the exercise and display of his faculty, his one interest in its application, his sole society with other specialists in his own line. His brain grows continually larger, at least so far as the portions engaging in mathematics are concerned. They bulge ever larger and seem to suck all life and figure from the rest of his frame. His limbs shrivel, his heart and digestive organs diminish, his insect face is hidden under its bulging contours. His voice becomes a mere stridulation for the stating of formula. He seems deaf to all but properly enunciated problems, the faculty of laughter, say, for the sudden discovery of some paradox is lost to him. His deepest emotion is the evolution of a novel, computation, and so he attains his end. Or again, a Selenite appointed to be a minder of moon calves is from his earliest years induced to think and live moon calf, to find his pleasure in moon calf law, his exercise in their tending and pursuit. He is trained to become wiry and active, his eyes indirated to the tight wrappings, the angular contours that constitute a smart moon calfishness. He takes at last no interest in the deeper part of the moon. He regards all Selenites, not equally versed in moon calves, with indifference, division, or hostility. His thoughts are of moon calf pastures, and his dialect an accomplished moon calf technique. So also he loves his work and discharges in perfect happiness the duty that justifies his being, and so it is with all sorts and conditions of Selenite. Each is a perfect unit in a world machine. These beings with big heads, on whom the intellectual labors form a sort of aristocracy in this strange society. And at the head of them, quintessential of the moon, is that marvelous gigantic ganglion, the grand lunar, into whose presence I am finally to come. The unlimited development of the minds of the intellectual class is rendered possible by the absence of any bonus skull in the lunar anatomy, that strange box of bone that clamps about the developing brain of man, imperiously insisting thus far, and no father to all his possibilities. They fall into three main classes, differing greatly in influence and respect. There are administrators, of whom Theo is one, Selenites of considerable initiative and versatility, responsible, each for a certain cubic content of the moon's bulk. The experts, like the football-headed thinker, who are trained to perform certain special operations, and the erudite, who are the repositories of all knowledge. To the latter class belongs Sci-Fi, the first lunar professor of terrestrial languages. With regard to these latter, it is a curious little thing to note that the unlimited growth of the lunar brain has rendered unnecessary the invention of all those mechanical aids to brain work which have distinguished the career of man. There are no books, no records of any sort, no libraries or inscriptions. All knowledge is stored in distended brains, much as the honey ants of Texas store honey in their distended abdomens. The Lunar Somerset House and the Lunar British Museum Library are collections of living brains. The less specialized administrators, I note, do for the most part take a very lively interest in me. Whenever they encounter me, they will come out of the way and stare at me, and ask questions to which Fire will reply. I see them going hither and ever, with a retinue of bearers, attendants, shouters, parachute carriers, and so forth. Queer groups to see. The experts for the most part ignore me completely. Even as they ignore each other, all notice me only to begin a glamorous exhibition of their distinctive skill. The erudite, for the most part, are wrapped in an impervious and apoplectic complacency from which only a denial of the erudition can rouse them. Usually, they are led about by little watchers and attendants, and often there are small and active-looking creatures, small females usually, that I am inclined to think are a sort of wife to them. But some of the profounder scholars are altogether to great for locomotion, and are carried from place to place. In a sort of sedan tub wobbling jellies of knowledge that enlist my respectful astonishment, I have just passed one in coming to this place, where I am permitted to amuse myself with these electrical toys. A vast shaven, shaky head, bald and thin-skinned, carried on his grotesque stretcher in front, and behind came his bearers and curious, almost trumpet-faced news disseminators. Shrieked his fame, I have already mentioned. The retinues that accompany most of the intellectuals, ushers bearers, valleys extraneous tentacles and muscles as it were, to replace the abortive, physical powers of these hypertrophied minds. Porters almost invariably accompany them. They are also extremely swift messengers, with spider-like legs and hands for grasping parachutes, and attendants with vocal organs that could well wake the dead. Apart from their controlling intelligence, these subordinates are as inert and helpless as umbrellas in a stand. They exist only in relation to the orders they have to obey, the duties they have to perform. The bulk of these insects, however, who go to and fro upon the spiral ways, who fill the ascending balloons and drop past me, clinging to flimsy parachutes are, I gather, of the operative class, machine hands indeed. Some of these are in actual nature, just not figure of speech. The single tentacle of the moon, Karth Herd, is profoundly modified for clawing, lifting, guiding, the rest of them no more than necessary. Subordinate appendages to these important mechanisms have enormously developed auditory organs, some whose work lies in delicate chemical operations, project a vast or factory organ. Others again have flat feet for treadles with ankylosed joints, and others who have been told are glass blowers seem mere lung bellows. But every one of these common selenites I have seen at work is exquisitely adapted to the social need it meets. Fine work is done by fine down workers, amazingly dwarfed underneath. Some I could hold on the palm of my hand. There's even a sort of turn-spit selenite, very common, whose duty and only delight it is to apply the motive power for various small appliances and to rule over these things and order any erring tendency there might be in some aberrant natures. Are the most muscular beings I have seen in the moon, sort of lunar police, who must have been trained from their earliest years to give a perfect respect and obedience to the swollen heads. The making of these various sorts of operative must be a very curious and interesting process. I am very much in the dark about it, but quite recently I came upon a number of young selenites confined in jars from which only the tholins protruded, who are being compressed to become machine minders of a special sort. The extended hand in this highly developed system of technical education is stimulated by irritants and nourished by injection, while the rest of the body is starved. Fire you unless I misunderstood him. Explain that in the earlier stages, these queer little creatures are apt to display signs of suffering in their various crap situations, but they easily become indurated to their lot, and he took me on to where a number of flexible-minded messengers were being drawn out and broken in. It is quite unreasonable, I know, but such glimpses of the educational methods of these beings affect me disagreeably. I hope, however, that may pass off, and I may be able to see more of this aspect of their wonderful social order. That wretched-looking hand, tentacle sticking out of its jar, seemed to have a sort of limp appeal for lost possibilities. It haunts me still, although of course it is really in the end a far more humane proceeding than our earthly method of leaving children to grow into human beings and then making machines of them. Quite recently, too, I think it was on the 11th or 12th visit I made to this apparatus, I had a curious light upon the lives of these operatives. I was being guided through a shortcut, either instead of going down the spiral and by the keys to the central sea, from the devious windings of a long Dark gallery, we emerged into a vast, low cavern pervaded by an earthy smell, and as things go in this darkness, rather brightly lit, the light came from a tumultuous growth of livid, fungoid shapes, some indeed singularly like outerrestrial mushrooms, but standing as high or higher than a man. Moonies eat these, said I to fire. Yes, food, goodness me, I cried. What's that? My eye had just caught the figure of an exceptionally big and ungainly selenite. Lying motionless among the stems, face downward we stopped. Dead, I asked, for as yet I have seen no dead in the moon. And I have grown curious, no, exclaimed, for you him worker. No work to do, get little drink, then make sleep till we him want, what could him wake? Hey, no want him walking about, there's another cry, die, and indeed, all that huge extent of mushroom ground was I found, peppered with these prostrate figures, sleeping under an opiate, until the moon had need of them. There were scores of them of all sorts, and we were able to turn over some of them and examine them. More precisely than I had been able to previously, they breathed noisily at my doing so, but did not wake one. I remember very distinctly, he left a strong impression, I think because of some trick of the light, and of his attitude was strongly suggestive of a drawn-up human figure. His fallens were long, delicate tentacles. He was some kind of refined manipulator, and the pose of his slumber suggested a submissive, suffering. No doubt, it was a mistake for me to interpret his expression in that way, but I did. And as far you rolled him over into the darkness, among the livid fleshiness again, I felt a distinctly unpleasant sensation. Although as he rolled, the insect in him was confessed, it simply illustrates the unthinking way in which one acquires habits of feeling. To drug the worker one does not want and toss him aside is surely far better than to expel him from his factory to wander starving in the streets. In every complicated social community, there is necessarily a certain intermittency of employment for all specialized labor. And in this way the trouble of an unemployed problem is altogether anticipated, and yet, so unreasonable are even scientifically trained minds. I still do not like the memory of those prostrate forms, amidst those quiet luminous arcades of fleshy growth, and I avoid that shortcut, in spite of the inconveniences of the longer, more noisy and more crowded alternative. My alternative route takes me round by a huge, shadowy cavern, very crowded and glamorous, and here it is, I see, peering out of the hexagonal openings of a sort of honeycomb war, operating a large open space behind, or selecting the toys and amulets made to please them by the dainty, tentacled jewelers who work in kennels below, the mothers of the moon world, the queen bees as it were of the hive. They are noble-looking beings, fantastically and sometimes quite beautifully adorned with a proud carriage, and save for their mouths almost microscopic heads, of the condition of the moon sexes, marrying and giving in marriage, and of birth and so forth among the Selenites. I have as yet been able to learn very little. With the steady progress of fire in English, however, my ignorance will no doubt as steadily disappear. I am of opinion that as with the ants and bees, there is a large majority of the members in this community of the nutter sex. Of course, on earth in our cities, there are now many who never lived that life of parentage, which is the natural life of man. Here as with the ants, this thing has become a normal condition of the race, and the whole of such replacement as is necessary falls upon this special and by no means numerous class of matrons, the mothers of the moon world, large and stately beings, beautifully fitted to bear the love all selenite. Unless I misunderstand an explanation of fires, they are absolutely incapable of cherishing the young. They bring into the moon periods of foolish indulgence, alternate with moods of aggressive violence, and as soon as possible the little creatures, who are quite soft and flabby and pale-colored, are transferred to the charge of celibate females, women workers as it were, who in some cases possess brains of almost masculine dimensions. Just at this point, unhappily, this message broke off. Fragmentary and tantalizing, as the matter constituting this chapter is, it does nevertheless give a vague, broad impression of an altogether strange and wonderful world, a world with which our own may have to reckon. We know not how speedily this intermittent trickle of messages, this whispering of a record needle in the stillness of the mountain slopes, is the first warning of such a change in human conditions as mankind has scarcely imagined heretofore in that satellite of ours. There are new elements, new appliances, traditions, an overwhelming avalanche of new ideas, a strange race with whom we must inevitably struggle for mastery. Gold as common as iron or wood. Chapter 25, The Grand Lunar, the penultimate message, describes with occasionally elaborate detail the encounter between Cavil and the Grand Lunar, who is the ruler or master of the moon. Cavil seems to have sent most of it without interference, but to have been interrupted in the concluding portion. The second came after an interval of a week. The first message begins, "At last I am able to resume this." It then becomes illegible for a space, and after a time resumed in mid-sentence. The missing words of the following sentence are, "Probably the crowd." There follows quite clearly grew evidencer. As we drew near the palace of the Grand Luna, if I may call a series of excavations a palace, everywhere faces stared at me, blank chitinous gapes and masks, eyes peering over tremendous old factory developments, eyes beneath monstrous forehead plates, an undergrowth of smaller creatures, dodged and yelped, and helmet faces poised on sinuous, long-jointed necks appeared, craning over shoulders and beneath armpits. Keeping a welcome space about me, marched a cordon of stolid, scuttle-headed guards who had joined us on our leaving the boat in which we had come. Along the channels of the Central Sea, the quick-eyed artist with a little brain joined us also, and a thick bunch of lean porter insects swayed and struggled under the multitude of conveniences that were considered essential to my state. I was carried in a litter during the final stage of our journey. This litter was made of some very ductile metal that looked dark to me, mached and woven and with bars of paler metal. And about me, as I advanced the group itself, a long and complicated procession, in front after the manner of heralds, marched for trumpet-faced creatures, making a devastating prey, and then came squat, resolute moving ushers before and behind, and on either hand a galaxy of learned heads, a sort of animated encyclopedia, who were fire explained to stand about the Grand Lunar, for purposes of reference, not a thing in lunar science, not a point of view or method of thinking, that these wonderful beings did not carry in their heads. Followed guards and porters, and then fires, shivering brain borne also on a litter. Then came Sci-Fi in a slightly less important litter, then myself, on a litter of greater elegance than any other, and surrounded by my food and drink attendants. More trumpeters came next, splitting the ear with vehement outcries, and then several big brains, special correspondents one might call them, or historiographers, charged with the task of observing and remembering every detail of this epoch-making interview. A company of attendants bearing and dragging banners and masses of scented fungus and curious symbols vanished in the darkness behind. The way was lined by ushers and officers, in comparisons that gleamed like steel, and beyond their line, so far as my eyes could pierce the gloom, the heads of that enormous crowd extended. I will own that I am still, by no means, indurated to the peculiar effect of the selenite appearance, and to find myself, as it were, adrift on this broad sea of excited entomology was by no means agreeable. Just for a space I had something very like what I should imagine people mean when they speak of the horrors. It had come to me before in these lunar caverns, when on occasion I have found myself weapons, and with an undefended back, amidst a crowd of these selenites, but never quite so vividly. It is, of course, as absolutely irrational a feeling as one could well have, and I hoped gradually to subdue it, but just for a moment. As I swept forward into the welter of the vast crowd, it was only by gripping my litter tightly and summoning all my willpower that I succeeded in avoiding an outcry or some such manifestation. It lasted perhaps 3 minutes. Then I had myself in hand again. We ascended the spiral of a vertical way for some time, and then passed through a series of huge holes, dome-roofed and elaborately decorated. The approach to the Grand Lunar was certainly contrived to give one a vivid impression of his greatness. Each cavern one entered seemed greater and more boldly arched than its predecessor. This effect of progressive size was enhanced by a thin haze of faintly phosphorescent blue incense that thickened as one advanced and robbed even the nearer figures of clearness. I seemed to advance continually to something larger, dimmer, and less material. I must confess that all this multitude made me feel extremely shabby and unworthy. I was unshaven and unkempt. I had brought no razor. I had a coarse beard over my mouth. On earth I have always been inclined to despise any attention to my person beyond a proper care for cleanliness, but under the exceptional circumstances in which I found myself representing, as I did my planet and my kind, and depending very largely upon the attractiveness of my appearance for a proper reception, I could have given much for something a little more artistic and dignified than the husks I wore. I have been so serene in the belief that the moon was uninhabited as to overlook such precautions altogether, as it was I was dressed in a flannel jacket, knickerbockers, and golfing stockings, stained with every sort of dirt the moon offered, slippers of which the left heel was wanting, and a blanket through a hole in which I thrust my head. These clothes indeed I still wear. Sharp bristles are anything but an improvement to my cast of features, and there was an unmended tear at the knee of my knickerbockers that showed conspicuously as I squatted in my litter. My right stocking, too, persisted in getting about my ankle. I am fully alive to the injustice my appearance did humanity, and if by any expedient I could have improvised something a little out of the way and imposing, I would have done so, but I could hit upon nothing. I did what I could with my blanket, folding it somewhat after the fashion of a toga, and for the rest, I sat as upright as the swaying of my litter permitted. Imagine the largest hole you have ever been in, imperfectly lit with blue light and obscured by a gray, blue fog surging with metallic or livid gray creatures of such a mad diversity. As I have hinted, imagine this hole to end in an open archway, beyond which is a still larger hole, and beyond this yet another and still larger one, and so on. At the end of the vista dimly seen, a flight of steps, like the steps of Aracheli at Rome, ascend out of sight, higher and higher. These steps appear to go as one draws near their base, but at last I came under a huge archway and beheld the summit of these steps, and upon it the Grand Lunar exalted on his throne. He was seated in what was relatively a blaze of incandescent blue. This and the darkness about him gave him an effect of floating in a blue-black void. He seemed a small self-luminous cloud, at first brooding on his somber throne. His brain case must have measured many yards in diameter. For some reason that I cannot fathom, a number of blue searchlights radiated from behind the throne on which he sat, and immediately encircling him was a halo about him, and little and indistinct in this glow, a number of body servants sustained and supported him, and overshadowed and standing in a huge semicircle beneath him were his intellectual subordinates, his remembrances and computators, and searchers and servants, and all the distinguished insects of the court of the moon. Still lower stood ushers and messengers, and then, all down the countless steps of the throne were guards, and at the base enormous, various indistinct, vanishing at last into an absolute black, a vast, swaying multitude of the minor dignitaries of the moon. Their feet made a perpetual, scraping whisper on the rocky floor, as their limbs moved with a rustling murmur. As I entered the penultimate hall, the music rose and expanded into an imperial magnificence of sound, and the shrieks of the newsbearers died away. I entered the last and greatest hall. My procession opened out like a fan. My ushers and guards went right and left, and the three letters bearing myself and fire. You inside Puff marched across a shiny darkness of floor to the foot of the giant stairs. Then began a vast, throbbing hum that mingled with the music. The two Selenites dismounted, but I was bidden remain seated. I imagine as a special honor. The music ceased, but not that humming, and by a simultaneous movement of 10,000 respectful heads, my attention was directed to the inhaled, supreme intelligence that hovered above me. At first, as I peered into the radiating glow, this quintessential brain looked very much like an opaque, featureless bladder with dim, undulating ghosts of convolutions, rising visibly within, then beneath its enormity. And just above the edge of the throne, one saw with a start minute, elfing eyes peering out of the glow, no face but eyes, as if they peered through holes. At first, I could see no more than these two staring little eyes, and then below I distinguished the little, dwarfed body and its insect-jointed limbs, shriveled and white. The eyes stared down at me with a strange intensity, and the lower part of the swollen globe was wrinkled. Ineffectual-looking little hand, tentacles steadied the shape on the throne. It was great, it was pitiful. One forgot the hole and the crowd. I ascended the staircase by jerks. It seemed to me that this darkly glowing brain case above us spread over me and took more and more of the whole effect into itself as I drew nearer. The tiers of attendants and helpers grouped about their master seemed to dwindle and fade into the night. I saw that shadowy attendants were busy spraying that great brain with a cooling spray and patting and sustaining it. For my own part, I sat, gripping my swaying litter and staring at the grand lunar, unable to turn my gaze aside. And at last, as I reached a little landing that was separated only by 10 steps or so from the supreme seat, the woven splendor of the music reached a climax and ceased, and I was left naked as it were. In that vastness, beneath the still scrutiny of the grand lunar's eyes, he was scrutinizing the first man he had ever seen. My eyes dropped at last from his greatness to the ant figures in the blue mist about him, and then down the steps to the masked Selenites, still and expectant in their thousands, packed on the floor below. Once again, an unreasonable horror reached out towards me and passed. After the pause came the salutation. I was assisted from my litter and stood awkwardly, while a number of curious and no doubt deeply symbolical gestures were vicariously performed for me by two slender officials, the encyclopedic galaxy of the learned, that had accompanied me to the entrance of the last hall, appeared 2 steps above me and left and right of me, in readiness for the grand lunar's need and fires. Pale brain placed itself about halfway up to the throne, in such a position as to communicate easily between us, without turning his back on either the grand lunar or myself. Puff took up position behind him. Dexterous ushers sidled sideways towards me. Keeping a full face to the presence, I seated myself Turkish fashion, and Fire You and Puff also knelt down above me. There came a pause. The eyes of the nearer court went from me to the grand lunar and came back to me, and they, hissing and piping of expectation, passed across the hidden multitudes below and ceased. That humming ceased. For the first and last time in my experience, the moon was silent. I became aware of a faint wheezy noise. The grand luna was addressing me. It was like the rubbing of a finger upon a pane of glass. I watched him attentively for a time, and then glanced at the alert Fire You. I felt amidst these slender beings, ridiculously thick and fleshy and solid, my head all jaw and black hair. My eyes went back to the grand luna. He had ceased, his attendants were busy, and his shining superfaces was glistening and running with cooling spray. Fire You meditated through an interval. He consulted Puff. Then he began piping his recognizable English, at first a little nervously, so that he was not very clear, and the Grand Luna wishes to say he gathers you are a man, that you are a man from the planet Earth. He wishes to say that he welcomes you and wishes to learn, if I may use the word, the state of your world, and the reason why you came to this. He paused. I was about to reply when he resumed. He proceeded to remarks, of which the drift was not very clear, though I am inclined to think they were intended to be complimentary. He told me that the Earth was to the moon what the sun is to the Earth, and that the Selenites desired very greatly to learn about the Earth and men. He then told me, no doubting compliment, also the relative magnitude and diameter of Earth and Moon, and the perpetual wonder and speculation with which the Selenites had regarded our planet. I meditated with downcast eyes, and decided to reply that men too had wondered what might lie in the moon, and had judged it dead, little recking of such magnificence as I had seen that day. The Grand Lunar, in token of recognition, caused his long blue rays to rotate in a very confusing manner, and all about the great hall ran the pipings and whisperings and rustlings of the report of what I had said. He then proceeded to putify you a number of increase, which were easier to answer. He understood. He explained that we lived on the surface of the Earth, that our air and sea what outside the globe, the latter part indeed. He already knew from his astronomical specialists. He was very anxious to have more detailed information of what he called this extraordinary state of affairs, for from the solidity of the Earth, there had always been a disposition to regard it as uninhabitable. He endeavored first to ascertain the extremes of temperature to which we, Earth beings, were exposed, and he was deeply interested by my descriptive treatment of clouds and rain. His imagination was assisted by the fact that the lunar atmosphere in the outer galleries of the night side is not infrequently very foggy. He seemed inclined to marvel that we did not find the sunlight too intense for our eyes, and was interested in my attempt to explain that the sky was tempered to a bluish color through the refraction of the air, though I doubt if he clearly understood that. I explained how the iris of the human eyes can contract the pupil and save the delicate internal structure from the excessive sunlight, and was allowed to approach within a few feet of the presence in order that this structure might be seen, this LED to a comparison of the lunar and terrestrial eyes. The former is not only excessively sensitive to such light as men can see, but it can also see heat, and every difference in temperature within the moon renders objects visible to it. The iris was quite a new organ to the Grand Lunar. For a time, he amused himself by flashing his rays into my face and watching my pupils contract. As a consequence, I was dazzled and blinded for some little time, but in spite of that discomfort, I found something reassuring, by insensible degrees, in the rationality of this business of question and answer. I could shut my eyes, think of my answer, and almost forget that the Grand Lunar has no face. When I had descended again to my proper place, the Grand Lunar asked how we shouted ourselves from heat and storms, and I expanded to him the arts of building and furnishing. Here, we wandered into misunderstandings and cross-purposes, due largely, I must admit, to the looseness of my expressions. For a long time, I had great difficulty in making him understand the nature of a house. To him and his attendants Selenites, it seems no doubt the most whimsical thing in the world that men should build houses when they might descend into excavations, and an additional complication was introduced by the attempt I made to explain that men had originally begun their homes in caves, and that they were now taking their railways and many establishments beneath the surface. Here, I think, a desire for intellectual completeness betrayed me. There was also a considerable tangle, due to an equally unwise attempt on my part, to explain about minds, dismissing this topic at last in an incomplete state. The Grand Lunar inquired what we did with the interior of our globe. He tired of twittering and piping, swept into the remotest corners of that great assembly, when it was at last made clear that we men know absolutely nothing of the contents of the world, upon which the immemorial generations of our ancestors had been evolved. 3 times had I to repeat that, of all the 4,000 miles of distance between the earth and its center, men knew only to the depth of a mile, and that very vaguely. I understood the Grand Lunar to ask, why had I come to the moon, seeing we had scarcely touched our own planet yet? But he did not trouble me at that time to proceed to an explanation, being too anxious to pursue the details of this mad inversion of all his ideas. He reverted to the question of weather, and I tried to describe the perpetually changing sky, and snow and frost and hurricanes. But when the night comes, he asked, is it not cold? I told him it was colder than by day. And does not your atmosphere freeze? I told him not that it was never cold enough for that, because our nights were so short, not even liquefy. I was about to say no, but then it occurred to me that one part at least of our atmosphere, the water vapor of it, does sometimes liquefy and form dew, and sometimes freeze and form frost, a process perfectly analogous to the freezing of all the external atmosphere of the moon during its longer night. I made myself clear on this point, and from that, the Grand Lunar went on to speak with me of sleep, for the need of sleep that comes so regularly, every 24 hours to all things, is part also of our earthly inheritance on the moon. They rest only at rare intervals, and after exceptional exertions. Then I try to describe to him the soft splendors of a summer night, and from that, I passed to a description of those animals that prowl by night and sleep by day. I told him of lions and tigers, and here it seemed as though we had come to a deadlock. For saving their waters, there are no creatures in the moon, not absolutely domestic and subject to his will, and so it has been for immemorial years. They have monstrous water creatures, but no evil beasts, and the idea of anything strong and large existing outside in the night is very difficult for them. The record here is too broken to transcribe for the space of perhaps 20 words or more. He talked with his attendants, as I suppose, upon the strange superficiality and unreasonableness of man, who lives on the mere surface of the world, a creature of waves and winds, and all the chances of space, who cannot even unite to overcome the beasts that prey upon his kind, and yet who dares to invade another planet. During this aside I sat thinking, and then at his desire, I told him of the different sorts of men. He searched me with questions, and for all sorts of work. You have the same sort of men, but who thinks, who governs? I gave him an outline of the democratic method. When I had done, he ordered cooling sprays upon his brow, and then requested me to repeat my explanation, conceiving something had miscarried. Do they not do different things, then set fire? Some, I admitted, were thinkers and some officials. Some hunted, some were mechanics, some artists, some toilets. But all rule, I said, and have they not different shapes to fit them to their different duties? None that you can see, I said, except perhaps for clothes. Their minds perhaps differ a little, I reflected. Their minds must differ a great deal, said the Grand Lunar, or they would all want to do the same things. In order to bring myself into a closer harmony with his preconceptions, I said that his surmise was right. It was all hidden in the brain, I said, but the difference was there. Perhaps if one could see the minds and souls of men, they would be as varied and unequal as the Selenites. There were great men and small men, men who could reach out far and wide, men who could go swiftly, noisy, trumpet-minded men, and men who could remember without thinking. The record is indistinct for 3 words. He interrupted me to recall me to my previous statements. But you said all men rule, he pressed. To a certain extent, I said, and made I fear. A denser fog with my explanation. He reached out to a salient fact. Do you mean, he asked, that there is no grand earthly? I thought of several people, but assured him finally there was none. I explained that such autocrats and emperors, as we had tried upon earth, had usually ended in drink or vice or violence, and that the large and influential section of the people of the earth to which I belonged, the Anglo-Saxons, did not mean to try that sort of thing again, and which the Grand Lunar was even more amazed. But how do you keep even such wisdom as you have? He asked, and I explained to him the way we helped our limited. A word omitted here, probably brains, with libraries of books. I explained to him how our science was growing by the united labors of innumerable little men, and on that he made no comment, say that it was evident we had mastered much, in spite of our social savagery, or we could not have come to the moon. Yet the contrast was very marked with knowledge. The Selenites grew and changed. Mankind stored their knowledge about them, and remained brutes equipped. He said this here. There is a short piece of the record indistinct. He then caused me to describe how we went about this earth of ours, and I described to him our railways and ships. For a time he could not understand that we had had the use of steam only 100 years. But when he did, he was clearly amazed. I may mention as a single thing that the Selenites use years to count by, just as we do on Earth. Though I can make nothing of their numeral system, that, however, does not matter because Fayu understands ours. From that, I went on to tell him that mankind had dwelt in cities only for 9 or 10,000 years, and that we were still not united in one brotherhood, but under many different forms of government. This astonished the Grand Lunar very much when it was made clear to him. At first, he thought we referred merely to administrative areas. Our states and empires are still the roar. Sketches of what order will someday be, I said. And so I came to tell him at this point, a length of record that probably represents 30 or 40 words is totally illegible. The Grand Lunar was greatly impressed by the folly of men in clinging to the inconvenience of diverse tongues. They want to communicate and yet not to communicate. He said, and then for a long time, he questioned me closely concerning war. He was at first perplexed and incredulous. You mean to say, he asked, seeking confirmation, that you run about over the surface of your world, this world, whose riches you have scarcely begun to scrape, killing one another for beasts to eat? I told him that was perfectly correct. He asked for particulars to assist his imagination, but do not ships and your poor little cities get injured? He asked, and I found the waste of property and conveniences seemed to impress him almost as much as the killing. Tell me more, said the Grand Luna. Make me see pictures. I cannot conceive these things. And so for a space, though something low with, I told him the story of earthly war. I told him of the first orders and ceremonies of war, of warnings and ultimatums, and the marching of troops. I gave him an idea of maneuvers and positions. And battle joined, I told him of sieges and assaults, of starvation and hardship in trenches, and of sentinels freezing in the snow. I told him of routes and surprises, and desperate last stands, and faint hopes, and the pitiless pursuit of fugitives, and the dead upon the field. I told too of the past of invasions and massacres, of the Huns and Tatars, and the wars of Muhammad and the caliphs, and of the Crusades. And as I went on, and Fayu translated, and the Selenites could, and murmured in a steadily intensified emotion. I told them an ironclad could fire a shot of a ton, 12 miles, and go through 20 feet of iron, and how we could steer torpedoes underwater. I went on to describe a Maxim gun in action, and what I could imagine of the Battle of Colenso. The Grand Lunar was so incredulous that he interrupted the translation of what I had said, in order to have my verification of my account. They particularly doubted my description of the men, cheering and rejoicing as they went into battle. But surely they do not like it translated, fire, I assured the men of my race. Considered battle the most glorious experience of life. At which the whole assembly was stricken with amazement. But what good is this war? Asked the Grand Lunar, sticking to his theme. Oh, as for good, said I, it thins the population. But why should there be a need? They came a pause. The cooling sprays impinged upon his brow. And then he spoke again, at this point a series of undulations that have been apparent as a perplexing complication as far back as Cavill's description of the silence that fell before the first, speaking of the Grand Luna, become confusingly predominant in the record. These undulations are evidently the result of radiations proceeding from a lunar source, and their persistent approximation to the alternating signals of Cavill is curiously suggestive of some operator deliberately seeking to mix them in with his message and render it illegible. At first they are small and regular, so that, with a little care and the loss of a very few words, we have been able to disentangle Cavill's message. Then they become broad and larger. Then suddenly they are irregular, with an irregularity that gives the effect, at last, of someone scribbling through a line of writing for a long time. Nothing can be made of this madly zigzagging trace. Then quite abruptly the interruption ceases, leaves a few words clear, and then resumes and continues for the rest of the message, completely obliterating whatever Cavill was attempting to transmit. Why, if this is indeed a deliberate intervention, the Selenite should have preferred to let cover go on, transmitting his message, in happy ignorance of their obliteration of its record, when it was clearly quite in their power, and much more easy and convenient for them to stop his proceedings at any time, is a problem to which I can contribute nothing. The thing seems to have happened so. And that is all I can say. This last rag of his description of the Grand Lunar begins in mid-sentence. Interrogated me very closely upon my secret. I was able, in a little while, to get an understanding with them, and at last to elucidate what has been a puzzle to me ever since I realized the vastness of their science, namely how it is they themselves have never discovered coverite. I find they know of it as a theoretical substance, but they have always regarded it as a practical impossibility, because for some reason there is no helium in the moon, and helium, across the last letters of helium, slashes the resumption of that obliterating trace. Note that word secret for that, and that alone. I base my interpretation of the message that follows, the last message, as both Mr. Wenderji and myself now believe it to be, that he is ever likely to send us. Chapter 26, the last message Cavill sent to the Earth, on this unsatisfactory manner. The penultimate message of Cavill dies out. One seems to see him away, there in the blue obscurity amidst his apparatus, intently signaling us to the last, all unaware of the curtain of confusion that drops between us, all unaware too of the final dangers that even then must have been creeping upon him. His disastrous want of vulgar common sense had utterly betrayed him. He had talked of war, he had talked of the strength and irrational violence of men, of their insatiable aggressions, their tireless futility of conflict. He had filled the whole moon world with this impression of our race, and then I think it is plain that he made the most fatal admission, that upon himself alone hung the possibility, at least for a long time, of any further men reaching the moon. The line the cold and human reason of the moon would take seems plain enough to me, and a suspicion of it, and then perhaps some sudden, sharp realization of it must have come to him. One imagines him about the moon, with the remorse of this fatal indiscretion growing in his mind. During a certain time, I am inclined to guess, the Grand Lunar was deliberating the new situation, and for all that time, Cavill may have gone as free as ever he had gone. But obstacles of some sort prevented his getting to his electromagnetic apparatus. Again, after that message I have just given, For some days we received nothing. Perhaps he was having fresh audiences and trying to evade his previous admissions. Who can hope to guess? And then suddenly, like a cry in the night, like a cry that is followed by a stillness, came the last message. It is the briefest fragment, the broken beginnings of two sentences. The first was, I was mad to let the Grand Luna know. There was an interval of perhaps a minute. One imagines some interruption from. With that, a departure from the instrument. A dreadful hesitation among the looming masses of apparatus in that dim, blue-lit cavern. A sudden rush back to it, full of a resolve that came too late. Then, as if it were hastily transmitted, came cover right made as follows. Take. They followed one word, a quite unmeaning word as it stands, Euless, and that is all it may be. He made a hasty attempt to spell useless when his fate was close upon him. Whatever it was that was happening about that apparatus, we cannot tell. Whatever it was, we shall never, I know, receive another message from the moon. For my own part, a vivid dream has come to my help, and I see almost as plainly as though I had seen it. In actual fact, a blue-lit shadowy, disheveled cavil, struggling in the grip of these insect selenites, struggling ever more desperately and hopelessly, as they press upon him, shouting, expostulating, perhaps even at last, fighting and being forced backwards, step by step, out of all speech or sign of his fellows, forevermore into the unknown, into the dark, into that silence that has no end. The Time Machine, performed by Hugh Bonneville. Chapter 1. The Time Traveler. For so it will be convenient to speak of him, was expanding a recondite matter to us. His gray eyes shone and twinkled, and his usually pale face was flushed and animated. The fire burned brightly, and the soft radiance of the incandescent lights in the lily of silver caught the bubbles that flashed and passed in our glasses. Our chairs, being his patents, embraced and caressed us, rather than submitted to be sat upon. And there was that luxurious after-dinner atmosphere when thought roams gracefully, free of the trammels of precision, and he put it to us in this way, marking the points with a lean forefinger, as we sat and lazily admired his earnestness over this new paradox, as we thought it, and his fecundity. You must follow me carefully. I shall have to controvert one or two ideas that are almost universally accepted. The geometry, for instance, they taught you at school, is founded on a misconception. Is not that rather a large thing to expect us to begin upon? Said Philby, an argumentative person with red hair. I do not mean to ask you to accept anything without reasonable ground for it. You will soon admit as much as I need from you. You know, of course, that a mathematical line, a line of thickness nil, has no real existence. They taught you that neither has a mathematical plane. These things are mere abstractions. That is all right, said the psychologist, nor having only length, breadth and thickness can a cube have a real existence. There I object, said Philby. Of course a solid body may exist. All real things, so most people think. But wait a moment, can an instantaneous cube exist? Don't follow you, said Philby. Can a cube that does not last for any time at all have a real existence? Philby became pensive. Clearly, the time traveler proceeded. Any real body must have extension in for directions. It must have length, breadth, thickness, and duration. But through a natural infirmity of the flesh, which I would explain to you in a moment, we incline to overlook this fact. There are really four dimensions, three which we will call the three planes of space, and a fourth time. There is, however, a tendency to draw an unreal distinction between the former three dimensions and the latter, because it happens that our consciousness moves intermittently in one direction along the latter, from the beginning to the end of our lives. That said a very young man, making spasmodic efforts to relight his cigar over the lamp, that very clear indeed. Now it is very remarkable that this is so extensively overlooked, continued the time traveler, with a slight accession of cheerfulness. Really, this is what is meant by the fourth dimension. Though some people who talk about the fourth dimension do not know they mean it. It is only another way of looking at time. There's no difference between time and any of the three dimensions of space, except that our consciousness moves along it. But some foolish people have got hold of the wrong side of that idea. You've all heard what they have to say about this fourth dimension. I have not said the provincial mayor. It is simply this: that space, as our mathematicians have it, is spoken of as having three dimensions, which one may call length, breadth, and thickness, and is always definable by reference to three planes, each at right angles to the others. But some philosophical people have been asking, why three dimensions particularly? Why not another direction, at right angles to the other three? And have even tried to construct a four-dimension geometry. Professor Simon Newcomb was expanding this to the New York Mathematical Society. Only a month or so ago, you know how on a flat surface, which has only two dimensions, we can represent a figure of a three-dimensional solid. And similarly, they think that by models of three dimensions, they could represent one of four. If they could master the perspective of the thing. See, I think so, murmured the provincial mayor, and knitting his brows, he lapsed into an introspective state, his lips moving as one who repeats mystic words. Yes, I think I see it now, he said, after some time, brightening in a quite transitory manner. Well, I do not mind telling you, I have been at work upon this geometry of four dimensions for some time. Some of my results are curious. For instance, here is a portrait of a man at 8 years old, another at 15, another at 17, another at 23, and so on. All these are evidently sections, as it were three-dimensional representations, of his four-dimension being, which is a fixed and unalterable thing. Scientific people preceded the time traveler, after the pause required for the proper assimilation of this, know very well that time is only a kind of space. Here is a popular scientific diagram. A weather record. This line I trace with my finger shows the movement of the barometer. Yesterday it was so high, yesterday night it fell. Then this morning it rose again, and so gently upward to here. Surely the mercury did not trace this line in any of the dimensions of space generally recognized, but suddenly it traced such a line. And that line, therefore, we must conclude was along the time dimension. But said the medical man, staring hard at a coal in the fire, if time is really only a fourth dimension of space, why is it, and why has it always been regarded as something different? And why cannot we move in time as we move about in the other dimensions of space? The time traveler smiled. Are you sure we can move freely in space, right and left? We can go backward and forward freely enough, and men always have done so. I admit we move freely into dimensions, but how about up and down? Gravitation limits us there. Not exactly, said the medical man. There are balloons, but before the balloons, say for spasmodic jumping and the inequalities of the surface, man had no freedom of vertical movement. Still they could move a little up and down. Set the medical man easier, far easier down than up. And you cannot move at all in time. You cannot get away from the present moment. My dear sir, that is just where you are wrong. That is just where the whole world has gone wrong. We are always getting away from the present moment. Our mental existences, which are immaterial and have no dimensions, are passing along the time dimension with a uniform velocity from the cradle to the grave, just as we should travel down if we began our existence 50 miles above the Earth's surface. But the great difficulty is this, interrupted the psychologist. You can move about in all directions of space, but you cannot move about in time. That is the germ of my great discovery. But you are wrong to say that we cannot move about in time. For instance, if I am recording an incident very vividly, I go back to the instant of its occurrence. I become absent-minded as you say I jump back for a moment. Of course, we have no means of staying back for any length of time, any more than a savage or an animal, as of staying 6 feet above the ground. But a civilized man is better off than the savage. In this respect, he can go up against gravitation in a balloon. And why should he not hope that ultimately he may be able to stop or accelerate his drift along the time dimension, or even turn about and travel the other way? "Oh, this," began Philby, "is all. Why not?" said the time traveler. "It's against reason," said Philby. "What reason?" said the time traveler. "You can show black is white by argument," said Philby, "but you will never convince me." "Possibly not," said the time traveler. "But now you begin to see the object of my investigations into the geometry of 4 dimensions. Long ago I had a vague inkling of a machine to travel through time," exclaimed the very young man, "that shall travel indifferently in any direction of space and time, as the driver determines." Philby contented himself with laughter. "But I have experimental verification," said the time traveler. "It would be remarkably convenient for the historian." The psychologist suggested one might travel back and verify the accepted account of the Battle of Hastings, for instance. "Don't you think you should attract attention?" said the medical man. "Our ancestors had no great tolerance for anachronisms. One might get one's Greek from the very lips of Homer, and Plato," the very young man thought, "in which case they would certainly plow you for the little girl. The German scholars have improved Greek so much." "Then there is the future," said the very young man. "Just think, one might invest all one's money, leave it to accumulated interest, and hurry on ahead to discover a society," said I, erected on a strictly communistic basis. "Of all the wild, extravagant theories," began the psychologist, "yes. So it seemed to me, and so I never talked of it until experimental verification." "Cried I, you are going to verify that the experiment?" cried Philby, who was getting brain-weary. "Let's see your experiment anyhow." "So the psychologist, though, it's all humbug, you know." The time traveler smiled round at us, then, still smiling faintly, and with his hands deep in his trouser pockets, he walked slowly out of the room, and we heard his slippers shuffling down the long passage to his laboratory. The psychologist looked at us. "I wonder what he's got, some sleight of hand trick or other," said the medical man, and Philby tried to tell us about a conjurer he had seen at Burslem, but before he had finished his preface, the time traveler came back, and Philby's anecdote collapsed. The thing the time traveler held in his hand was a glittering metallic framework, scarcely larger than a small clock, and very delicately made. There was ivory in it, and some transparent crystalline substance. And now I must be explicit for this that follows, unless his explanation is to be accepted, is an absolutely unaccountable thing. He took one of the small octagonal tables that was scattered about the room and set it in front of the fire with 2 legs on the hearthrug. On this table he placed the mechanism. Then he drew up a chair and sat down. The only other object on the table was a small, shaded lamp, the bright light of which fell upon the model. There were also perhaps a dozen candles, about 2 in brass candlesticks upon the mantel, and several inscenses, so that the room was brilliantly illuminated. I sat in a low armchair nearest the fire, and I drew this forward so as to be almost between the time traveler and the fireplace. Philby sat behind him, looking over his shoulder. The medical man and the provincial mayor watched him in profile. From the right, the psychologist. From the left, the very young man stood behind the psychologist. We were all on the alert. It appears incredible to me that any kind of trick, however subtly conceived and however adroitly done, could have been played upon us under these conditions. The time traveler looked at us, and then at the mechanism. "Well," said the psychologist, This little affair, said the time traveler, resting his elbows upon the table and pressing his hands. Together above the apparatus is only a model. It is my plan for a machine to travel through time. You will notice that it looks singularly obscure and that there is an odd, twinkling appearance about this bar, as though it was in some way unreal. He pointed to the part with his finger also. Here is one little white lever, and here is another. The medical man got him out of his chair and peered into the thing. It's beautifully made, he said. It took 2 years to make, retorted the time traveler. Then, when we had all imitated the action of the medical man, he said, now, I want you clearly to understand that this lever, being pressed over, sends the machine gliding into the future, and this other reverses the motion. This saddle represents the seat of a time traveler. Presently, I am going to press the lever, and off the machine will go. It will vanish, pass into future time, and disappear. Have a good look at the thing. Look at the table too, and satisfy yourselves there is no trickery. I don't want to waste this model, and then be told I'm a quack. There was a minute's pause. Perhaps the psychologist seemed about to speak to me, but changed his mind then. The time traveler put forth his finger towards the lever. No, he said suddenly, lend me your hand. And turning to the psychologist, he took that individual's hand in his own and told him to put out his forefinger, so that it was the psychologist himself who sent forth the model time machine on its interminable voyage. We all saw the lever turn. I am absolutely certain there was no trickery. There was a breath of wind and the lamp flame jumped. One of the candles on the mantel was blown out, and the little machine suddenly swung round, became indistinct, was seen as a ghost for a second, perhaps as an eddy of faintly glittering brass and ivory, and it was gone, vanished. Save for the lamp, the table was bare. Everyone was silent for a minute. Then Philby said he was damned. The psychologist recovered from his stupid and suddenly looked under the table. At that, the time traveler laughed cheerfully. Well, he said with the reminiscence of the psychologist. Then getting up, he went to the tobacco jar on the mantel, and with his back to us began to fill his pipe. We stared at each other. Look here, said the medical man. Are you in earnest about this? Do you seriously believe that? That machine has traveled into time, certainly, said the time traveler, stooping to light a spill at the fire. Then he turned, lighting his pipe, to look at the psychologist's face. The psychologist, to show that he was not unhinged, helped himself to a cigar and tried to light it uncut. What is more, I have a big machine nearly finished in there. He indicated the laboratory, and when that is put together, I mean to have a journey on my own account. You mean to say that? That machine has traveled into the future, said Philby. Into the future or the past? I don't for certain know which. After an interval, the psychologist had an inspiration. It must have gone into the past if it has gone anywhere. He said, why? Said the time traveler. Because I presume that it has not moved in space, and if it traveled into the future, it would still be here all this time, since it must have traveled through this time. But I said, if it traveled into the past, it would have been visible when we came first into this room, and last Thursday when we were here, and the Thursday before that, and so forth. Serious objections, remarked the provincial mayor with an air of impartiality, turning towards the time traveler. Not a bit, said the time traveler. And to the psychologist, you think you can explain that? It's presentation below the threshold. You know, diluted presentation. Of course, said the psychologist, and reassured us that's a simple point of psychology. I should have thought of it. It's played enough and helps the paradox delightfully. We cannot see it, nor can we appreciate this machine any more than we can the spoke of a wheel spinning. or a bullet flying through the air, if it is traveling through time 50 times or 100 times. Faster than we are if it gets through a minute, while we get through a second. The impression it creates would, of course, be only 1/50th or 100th of what it would make if it were not traveling in time. That's plain enough. He passed his hand through the space in which the machine had been. You see, he said, laughing. We sat and stared at the vacant table for a minute or so. Then the time traveler asked us what we thought of it all. "It sounds plausible enough tonight," said the medical man, "but wait until tomorrow. Wait for the common sense of the morning. Would you like to see the time machine itself?" asked the time traveler, and therewith taking the lamp in his hand, he led the way down the long, drafty corridor to his laboratory. I remember vividly the flickering light, his queer broad head and silhouette, the dance of the shadows, how we all followed him, puzzled but incredulous, and how there in the laboratory we beheld a larger edition of the little mechanism, which we had seen vanish from before our eyes. Parts would have nickel, parts of ivory. Parts had certainly been filed or sworn out of rock crystal. The thing was generally complete, but the twisted crystalline bars lay unfinished upon the bench, beside some sheets of drawings, and I took one up for a better look at it. Quartz it seemed to be. "Look here," said the medical man. "Are you perfectly serious, or is this a trick? Like that ghost you showed us last Christmas, upon that machine?" said the time traveler, holding the lamp aloft. "I intend to explore time, is that plain? I was never more serious in my life." None of us quite knew how to take it. I caught Philby's eye over the shoulder of the medical man, and he winked at me solemnly. Chapter 2. I think that at that time, none of us quite believed in the time machine. The fact is, the time traveler was one of those men who were too clever to be believed. You never felt that you saw all around him. You always suspected some subtle reserve, some ingenuity, an ambush behind his lucid frankness. And Philby shone the model and explained the matter in the time traveler's words. We should have shown him far less skepticism, for we should have perceived his motives. A pork butcher could understand Philby, but the time traveler had more than a touch of whim among his elements, and we distrusted him. Things that would have made the frame of a less clever man seemed tricks in his hands. It is a mistake to do things too easily. The serious people who took him seriously never felt quite sure of his department. They were somehow aware that trusting their reputations for judgment with him was like furnishing a nursery with eggshell china. So I didn't think any of us said very much about time traveling. In the interval between that Thursday and the next, there were odd potentialities. Ran no doubt in most of our minds, its plausibility, that is, its practical incredibleness, the curious possibilities of anachronism, and of utter confusion it suggested. For my own part, I was particularly preoccupied with the trick of the model that I remember discussing with the medical man, whom I met on Friday at the Linnean. He said he had seen a similar thing at Tubing and laid considerable stress on the blowing out of the candle. But how the trick was done, he could not explain. The next Thursday I went again to Richmond, I suppose. I was one of the time traveler's most constant guests, and arriving late found 4 or 5 men already assembled in his drawing room. The medical man was standing before the fire, with a sheet of paper in one hand and his watch in the other. I looked around for the time traveler, and it's 7:30 now, said the medical man. I suppose we better have dinner. Where, said I. Naming our host, you've just come. It's rather odd he's unavoidably detained. He asks me in this note to lead off with dinner at 7. If he's not back, says he'll explain when he comes. It seems a pity to let the dinner spoil, said the editor of a well-known daily paper, and thereupon the doctor rang the bell. The psychologist was the only person, besides the doctor and myself, who had attended the previous dinner. The other men were blank. The editor aforementioned a certain journalist, and another a quiet, shy man with a beard whom I didn't know and who, as far as my observation went, never opened his mouth all the evening. There was some speculation at the dinner table about the time traveler's absence, and I suggested time traveling in a half-jocular spirit. The editor wanted that explained to him, and the psychologist volunteered a wooden account of the ingenious paradox and trick we had witnessed. That day week, he was in the midst of his exposition when the door from the corridor opened, slowly and without noise. I was facing the door and saw it first. "Hello," I said at last, and the door opened wider, and the time traveler stood before us. I gave a cry of surprise. "Good heavens, man, what's the matter?" cried the medical man who saw him next, and the whole table fall turned towards the door. He was in an amazing plight. His coat was dusty and dirty, and smeared with green down the sleeves. His hair disordered, and as it seemed to me, grayer either with dust and dirt, or because its color had actually faded. His face was ghastly pale. His chin had a brown cut on it. A cut half healed. His expression was haggard and drawn, as by intense suffering. For a moment he hesitated in the doorway, as if he had been dazzled by the light. Then he came into the room. He walked with just such a limp as I have seen in foot-saw tramps. We stared at him in silence, expecting him to speak. He said not a word, but came painfully to the table and made a motion towards the wine. The editor filled a glass of champagne and pushed it towards him. He drained it, and it seemed to do him good, for he looked around the table, and the ghost of his old smile flickered across his face. "What on earth have you been up to, man?" said the doctor. The time traveler did not seem to hear. "Don't let me disturb you," he said with a certain faltering articulation. "I'm all right." He stopped, held out his glass for more, and took it off at a draught. "Ah, that's good," he said. His eyes grew brighter, and a faint color came into his cheeks. His glance flicked over our faces with a certain dull approval, and then went round the warm and comfortable room. Then he spoke again, still as it were, feeling his way among his words. "I'm going to wash and dress, and then I'll come down and explain things. Save me some of that mutton. I'm starving for a bit of meat." He looked across at the editor, who was a rare visitor, and hoped he was all right. The editor began a question. "Tell you presently," said the time traveler. "I'm funny. Be all right in a minute." He put down his glass and walked towards the staircase door. Again I remarked his lameness and the soft padding sound of his footfall, and standing up in my place, I saw his feet as he went out. He had nothing on them but a pair of tattered, blood-stained socks. Then the door closed upon him. I had half a mind to follow, till I remembered how he detested any fuss about himself. For a minute perhaps my mind was wool-gathering. Then remarkable behavior of an eminent scientist, I heard the editor say, thinking after his wound in headlines. And this brought my attention back to the bright dinner table. "What's the game?" said the journalist. "Has he been doing the amateur gadget?" I don't follow. I met the eye of the psychologist and read my own interpretation. In his face I thought of the time traveler, limping painfully upstairs. I don't think anyone else had noticed his lameness. The first to recover completely from this surprise was the medical man who rang the bell. The time traveler hated to have servants waiting at dinner for a hot plate. At that, the editor turned to his knife and fork with a grunt, and the silent man followed suit. The dinner was resumed. Conversation was exclamatory for a little while, with gaps of wonderment. And then the editor got fervent in his curiosity. Does our friend eke out his modest income with a crossing, or has he his Nebuchadnezzar phases? he inquired. "I feel assured it's this business of the time machine," I said, and took up the psychologist's account. Of our previous meeting, the new guests were frankly incredulous. The editor raised objections. What was this time traveling? A man couldn't cover himself with dust by rolling in a paradox hoodie. And then as the idea came home to him, he resorted to caricature. Hadn't they any clothes brushes in the future? The journalist, too, would not believe at any price, and joined the editor in the easy work of heaping ridicule. On the whole thing, they were both the new kind of journalist. Very joyous, irreverent young men. Our special correspondent in The Day After Tomorrow reports the journalist was saying, or rather shouting, when the time traveler came back. He was dressed in ordinary evening clothes, and nothing save his haggard look remained of the change that had startled me. "I say," said the editor hilariously, "these chaps here say you have been traveling into the middle of next week. Tell us all about little Roseberry. What will you take for the lot?" The time traveler came to the place reserved for him. Without a word, he smiled quietly in his old way. "Where's my mutton?" he said. "What a treat it is to stick a fork into meat again." "Story," cried the editor. "Story be damned," said the time traveler. "I want something to eat. I won't say a word until I get some peptone into my arteries. Thanks, and the salt." "One word," said I. "Have you been time traveling?" "Yes," said the time traveler with his mouth full, nodding his head. "I'd give a shilling a line for a verbatim note," said the editor. The time traveler pushed his glass towards the silent man and rang it with his fingernail, at which the silent man, who had been staring at his face, started convulsively and poured him wine. The rest of the dinner was uncomfortable. For my own part, sudden questions kept on rising to my lips, and I dare say it was the same with the others. The journalist tried to relieve the tension by telling anecdotes of Hetty Potter. The time traveler devoted his attention to his dinner and displayed the appetite of a tramp. The medical man smoked a cigarette and watched the time traveler through his eyelashes. The silent man seemed even more clumsy than usual and drank champagne with regularity and determination. Out of sheer nervousness, at last the time traveler pushed his plate away and looked around us. "I suppose I must apologize," he said. "I was simply starving. I've had a most amazing time." He reached out his hand for a cigar and cut the end. "But come into the smoking room. It's too long a story to tell." Over greasy plates and ringing the bell in passing, he led the way into the adjoining room. "You have told blank and dash and shows about the machine," he said to me, leaning back in his easy chair, naming the 3 new guests. "But the thing's a mere paradox," said the editor. "I can't argue tonight. I don't mind telling you the story, but I can't argue. I will," he went on, "tell you the story of what has happened to me, if you like, but you must refrain from interruptions. I want to tell it badly. Most of it will sound like lying. So be it, it's true, every word of it all the same. I was in my laboratory at 4 o'clock, and since then I've lived 8 days. Such days as no human being ever lived before. I'm nearly worn out. But I shan't sleep till I told this thing over to you. Then I shall go to bed, but no interruptions. Is it agreed?" "Agreed," said the editor, and the rest of us echoed agreed. And with that the time traveler began his story. As I have set it forth, he sat back in his chair at first and spoke like a weary man. Afterwards he got more animated. In writing it down, I feel with only too much keenness the inadequacy of pen and ink, and above all my own inadequacy to express its quality. You read, I will suppose, attentively enough, but you cannot see the speaker's white, sincere face in the bright circle of the little lamp, nor hear the intonation of his voice. You cannot know how his expression followed the turns of his story. Most of us heroes were in shadow. for the candles in the smoking room had not been lighted, and only the face of the journalist and the legs of the silent man from the knees downward were illuminated. At first we glanced now and again at each other. After a time we ceased to do that and looked only at the time traveler's face. Chapter 3. I told some of you last Thursday of the principles of the time machine and showed you the actual thing itself. Incomplete in the workshop, there it is now, a little travel-worn truly, and one of the ivory bars is cracked, and a brass rail bent, but the rest of it sound enough. I expected to finish it on Friday. But on Friday, when the putting together was nearly done, I found one of the nickel bars was exactly 1 inch too short, and this I had to get remade, so that the thing was not complete until this morning. It was at 10 o'clock today that the first of all time machines began its career. I gave it a last tap, tried all the screws again, put one more drop of oil on the quartz rod, and sat myself in the saddle. I suppose a suicide who holds a pistol to his skull feels much the same wonder at what will come next. As I felt then, I took the starting lever in one hand, and the stopping one and the other, pressed the first, and almost immediately the second I seemed to reel. I felt a nightmare sensation of falling, and looking around, I saw the laboratory exactly as before. Had anything happened, for a moment, I suspected that my intellect had tricked me. Then I noted the clock a moment before, as it seemed it had stood at a minute or so past 10. Now it was nearly 3:30. I drew a breath, set my teeth, gripped the starting lever with both hands, and went off with a thud. The laboratory got hazy and went dark. Mrs. Watchett came in and walked, apparently without seeing me, towards the garden door, I suppose. It took her a minute or so to traverse the place, but to me, she seemed to shoot across the room like a rocket. I pressed the lever over to its extreme position. The night came like the turning out of a lamp, and in another moment came tomorrow. The laboratory grew faint and hazy, then fainter and ever fainter. Tomorrow night came black. Then day again, night again, day again, faster and faster still. An eddying murmur filled my ears, and a strange, dumb confusedness descended on my mind. I'm afraid I cannot convey the peculiar sensations of time traveling. They are excessively unpleasant. There is a feeling exactly like that one has upon a switchback of a helpless headlong motion. I felt the same horrible anticipation too, of an imminent smash as I put on pace. Night followed day like the flapping of a black wing. The dim suggestion of the laboratory seemed presently to fall away from me, and I saw the sun hopping swiftly across the sky, leaping at every minute and every minute marking a day. I suppose the laboratory had been destroyed, and I had come into the open air. I had a dim impression of scaffolding, but I was already going too fast to be conscious of any moving things. The slowest snail that ever crawled dashed by too fast for me. The twinkling succession of darkness and light was excessively painful to the eye. Then in the intermittent darknesses, I saw the moon spinning swiftly through her quarters, from new to full, and had a faint glimpse of the circling stars. Presently, as I went on, still gaining velocity, the palpitation of night and day merged into one continuous grayness. The sky took on a wonderful deepness of blue, a splendid luminous color like that of early twilight. The jerking sun became a streak of fire, a brilliant arch in space, the moon a fainter fluctuating band, and I could see nothing of the stars, save now and then a brighter circle flickering in the blue. The landscape was misty and vague. I was still on the hillside, upon which this house now stands, and the shoulder rose above me, gray and dim. I saw trees growing and changing like puffs of vapor, now brown, now green. They grew, spread, shivered, and passed away. I saw huge buildings rise up, faint and fair, and pass like dreams. The whole surface of the earth seemed changed, melting and flowing under my eyes, the little hands upon the dials, That registered my speed raced round, faster and faster presently. I noted that the sun belt swayed up and down, from solstice to solstice, in a minute or less, and that consequently my pace was over a year. A minute, and minute by minute, the white snow flashed across the world and vanished, and was followed by the bright, brief green of spring. The unpleasant sensations of the start were less poignant now. They merged, at last, into a kind of hysterical exhilaration. I remarked indeed a clumsy swaying of the machine, for which I was unable to account. But my mind was too confused to attend to it, so with a kind of madness growing upon me, I flung myself into futurity. At first I scarce thought of stopping, scarce thought of anything but these new sensations. But presently, a fresh series of impressions grew up in my mind, a certain curiosity, and therewith a certain dread, until at last they took complete possession of me. What strange developments of humanity! What wonderful advances upon our rudimentary civilization! I thought might not appear when I came to look nearly into the dim, elusive world that raced and fluctuated before my eyes. I saw great and splendid architecture rising about me, more massive than any buildings of our own time. And yet, as it seemed built of glimmer and mist, I saw a richer green flow up the hillside, and remain there without any wintry intermission. Even through the veil of my confusion, the earth seemed very fair. And so my mind came round to the business of stopping. The peculiar risk lay in the possibility of my finding some substance in the space which I or the machine occupied. So long as I traveled at a high velocity through time, this scarcely mattered. I was, so to speak, attenuated with, slipping like a vapor, through the interstices of intervening substances. But to come to a stop involved the jamming of myself, molecule by molecule, into whatever lay in my way, meant bringing my atoms into such intimate contact with those of the obstacle that a profound chemical reaction, possibly a far-reaching explosion, would result and blow myself and my apparatus out of all possible dimensions into the unknown. This possibility had occurred to me again and again while I was making the machine, but then I had cheerfully accepted it as an unavoidable risk, one of the risks a man has got to take. Now the risk was inevitable. I no longer saw it in the same cheerful light. The fact is that insensibly, the absolute strangeness of everything, the sickly jarring and swaying of the machine, above all the feeling of prolonged falling, had absolutely upset my nerve. I told myself that I could never stop, and with a gust of petulance, I resolved to stop forthwith like an impatient fool. I lugged over the lever, and incontinently the thing went reeling over, and I was flung headlong through the air. There was the sound of a clap of thunder. In my ears I may have been stunned for a moment. A piteous hail was hissing around me. I was sitting on soft turf in front of the overset machine. Everything still seemed gray, but presently I remarked that the confusion in my ears was gone. I looked around me. I was on what seemed to be a little lawn in a garden, surrounded by rhododendron bushes, and I noticed that their mauve and purple blossoms were dropping in a shower. Under the beating of the hailstones, the rebounding, dancing hail hung in a cloud over the machine and drove along the ground like smoke. In a moment I was wet to the skin. "Fine hospitality," said I, "to a man who has traveled innumerable years to see you." Presently I thought, what a fool I was to get wet. I stood up and looked around me. A colossal figure, carved apparently in some white stone, loomed indistinctly beyond the rhododendron, through the hazy downpour, but all else of the world was invisible. My sensations would be hard to describe. As the columns of hail grew thinner, I saw the white figure more distinctly. It was very large, for a silver birch tree touched its shoulder. It was of white marble in shape, something like a winged sphinx, but the wings instead of being carried vertically at the sides, were spread so that it seemed to hover. The pedestal, it appeared to me, was of bronze and was thick with vertebrae. It chanced that the face was towards me. The sightless eyes seemed to watch me. There was the faint shadow of a smile on the lips. It was greatly weather-worn, and that imparted an unpleasant suggestion of disease. I stood looking at it for a little space. Half a minute perhaps, or half an hour, it seemed to advance and to recede. As the hail drove before its denser or thinner, at last I tore my eyes from it for a moment, and saw that the hail curtain had worn threadbare, and that the sky was lightening with the promise of the sun. I looked up again at the crouching wide shape, and the full temerity of my voyage came suddenly upon me. What might appear, when that hazy curtain was altogether withdrawn? What might not have happened to man? What if cruelty had grown into a common passion? What if in this interval the race had lost its manliness and had developed into something inhuman, unsympathetic and overwhelmingly powerful? I might seem some old-world savage animal, only the more dreadful and disgusting for our common likeness. A foul creature to be incontinently slain. Already I saw other vast shapes. Huge buildings with intricate parapets and tall columns, with a wooded hillside dimly creeping in upon me. Through the lessening storm, I was seized with a panic fear. I turned frantically to the time machine and strove hard to readjust it. As I did so, the shafts of the sun smoked through the thunderstorm. The gray downpour was swept aside and vanished, like the trailing garments of a ghost, above me in the intense blue of the summer sky. Some faint brown shreds of cloud whirled into nothingness. The great buildings about me stood out, clear and distinct, shining with the wet of the thunderstorm, and picked out in white by the unmelted hailstones. Piled along their courses, I felt naked in a strange world. I felt as perhaps a bird may feel in the clear air, knowing the hawk wings above and will swoop. My fear grew to frenzy. I took a breathing space, set my teeth and again grappled fiercely, wrist and knee with the machine. It gave under my desperate onset and turned over. It struck my chin violently, one hand on the saddle, the other on the lever. I stood panting heavily in attitude to mount again, but with this recovery of a prompt retreat. My courage recovered. I looked more curiously and less fearfully at this world of the remote future. In a circular opening, high up in the wall of the nearer house, I saw a group of figures clad in rich, soft robes. They had seen me, and their faces were directed towards me. Then I heard voices approaching me. Coming through the bush by the white sphinx were the heads and shoulders of men running. One of these emerged in a pathway leading straight to the little lawn upon which I stood with my machine. He was a slight creature, perhaps 4 feet high, clad in a purple tunic, girdled at the waist with a leather belt, sandals or baskins. I could not clearly distinguish which were on his feet. His legs were bare to the knees and his head was bare. Noticing that, I noticed for the first time how warm the air was. He struck me as being a very beautiful and graceful creature, but indescribably frail. His flushed face reminded me of the more beautiful, kind of consumptive, that hectic beauty of which we used to hear so much. At the sight of him, I suddenly regained confidence. I took my hands from the machine. Chapter 4. In another moment we were standing face to face, I and this fragile thing, out of futurity. He came straight up to me and laughed into my eyes, the absence from his bearing of any sign of fear struck me at once. Then he turned to the 2 others who were following him and spoke to them in a strange and very sweet and liquid tongue. There were others coming, and presently, a little group of perhaps 8 or 10 of these exquisite creatures were about me. One of them addressed me. It came into my head, oddly enough, that my voice was too harsh and deep for them, so I shook my head and pointing to my ears, shook it again, he came a step forward, hesitated, and then touched my hand. Then I felt other soft, little tentacles upon my back and shoulders. They wanted to make sure I was real. There was nothing in this at all alarming indeed. There was something in these pretty, little people that inspired confidence, a graceful gentleness, a certain childlike ease. And besides, they looked so frail that I could fancy myself flinging the whole dozen of them about, like 9 pins. But I made a sudden motion to warn them when I saw their little pink hands, feeling at the time machine happily. Then when it was not too late, I thought of a danger I had hitherto forgotten, and reaching over the bars of the machine, I unscrewed the little levers that would set it in motion, and put these in my pocket. Then I turned again to see what I could do in the way of communication. And then looking more nearly into their features, I saw some further peculiarities in their Dresden China type of prettiness. Their hair, which was uniformly curly, came to a sharp end at the neck and cheek. There was not the faintest suggestion of it on the face. And their ears were singularly minute. The mouths were small with bright red, rather thin lips, and the little chins ran to a point. The eyes were large and mild. And this may seem megatism on my part. I fancied even that there was a certain lack of the interest I might have expected in them, as they made no effort to communicate with me, but simply stood around me smiling and speaking in soft, cooing notes to each other. I began the conversation. I pointed to the time machine and to myself, then hesitating for a moment how to express time, I pointed to the sun, at once a quaintly pretty little figure in checkered purple and white, followed my gesture and then astonished me by imitating the sound of thunder. For a moment I was staggered that the import of his gesture was plain enough. The question had come into my mind abruptly: were these creatures fools? You may hardly understand how it took me. You see, I had always anticipated that the people of the year 800 to 1000 odd would be incredibly in front of us in knowledge, art, everything. Then one of them suddenly asked me a question that showed him to be on the intellectual level of one of our 5-year-old children. Asked me, in fact, if I had come from the sun in a thunderstorm. It let loose the judgment I had suspended upon their clothes, their frail light limbs and fragile features. A flow of disappointment rushed across my mind. For a moment, I felt that I had built the time machine in vain. I nodded, pointed to the sun, and gave them such a vivid rendering of a thunderclap as startled them. They all withdrew a pace or so and bowed. Then came one laughing towards me, carrying a chain of beautiful flowers, altogether new to me, and put it about my neck. The idea was received with melodious applause, and presently they were all running to and fro for flowers, and laughingly flinging them upon me, until I was almost smothered with blossom. You who have never seen the like can scarcely imagine what delicate and wonderful flowers countless years of culture had created. Then someone suggested that that plaything should be exhibited in the nearest building, and so I was led past the Sphinx of white marble, which had seemed to watch me, all the while with a smile at my astonishment, towards a vast gray edifice of fretted stone. As I went with them, the memory of my confident anticipations of a profoundly grave and intellectual posterity came with irresistible merriment to my mind. The building had a huge entry, and was altogether of colossal dimensions. I was naturally most occupied with the growing crowd of little people, and with the big open portals that yawned before me, shadowy and mysterious. My general impression of the world I saw over their heads was a tangled waste of beautiful bushes and flowers, a long neglected and yet weedless garden. I saw a number of tall spikes of strange white flowers, measuring a foot, perhaps, across the spread of the wax and petals. They grew, scattered as if wild among the variegated shrubs, But as I say, I did not examine them closely at this time. The time machine was left deserted on the turf, among the rhododendrons. The arch of the doorway was richly carved, but naturally. I did not observe the carving very narrowly, though I fancied I saw suggestions of old Phoenician decorations as I passed through, and it struck me that they were very badly broken and weather-worn. Several more brightly clad people met me in the doorway, and so we entered. I dressed in dingy 19th century garments, looking grotesque enough, garlanded with flowers, and surrounded by an eddying mass of bright, soft-colored robes and shining white limbs. In a melodious world of laughter and laughing speech, the big doorway opened into a proportionately great hall, hung with brown. The roof was in shadow, and the windows, partially glazed with colored glass and partially unglazed, admitted a tempered light. The floor was made up of huge blocks of some very hard, white metal, not plates nor slabs blocks, and it was so much worn, as I judged by the going to and fro of past generations, as to be deeply channeled along the more frequented ways. Transverse to the length were innumerable tables, made of slabs of polished stone, raised perhaps a foot from the floor, and upon these were heaps of fruits. Some I recognize as a kind of hypertrophied raspberry and orange, but for the most part they were strange. Between the tables was scattered a great number of cushions. Upon these my conductors seated themselves, signing for me to do likewise. With the pretty absence of ceremony, they began to eat the fruit with their hands, flinging peel and stalks and so forth into the round openings in the sides of the tables. I was not close to follow their example, for I felt thirsty and hungry. As I did so, I surveyed the hall at my leisure, and perhaps the thing that struck me most was its dilapidated look. The stained glass windows, which displayed only a geometrical pattern, were broken in many places, and the curtains that hung across the lower end were thick with dust, and it caught my eye that the corner of the marble table near me was fractured. Nevertheless, the general effect was extremely rich and picturesque. There were perhaps a couple of hundred people dining in the hall, and most of them, seated as near to me as they could come, were watching me with interest, their little eyes shining over the foods they were eating. All were clad in the same soft and yet strong, silky material. Fruit, by the by, was all their diet. These people of the remote future were strict vegetarians, and while I was with them, in spite of some carnal cravings, I had to be frugivorous also. Indeed, I found afterwards that horses, cattle, sheep, dogs had followed the ichthyosaurus into extinction. But the fruits were very delightful. One in particular that seemed to be in season all the time I was there, a flowery thing in a three-sided husk, was especially good, and I made it my staple. At first I was puzzled by all these strange fruits and by the strange flowers I saw, but later I began to perceive their import. However, I am telling you of my fruit dinner in the distant future now. So soon as my appetite was a little checked, I determined to make a resolute attempt to learn the speech of these new men of mine. Clearly, that was the next thing to do. The fruits seemed a convenient thing to begin upon, and holding one of these up, I began a series of interrogative sounds and gestures. I had some considerable difficulty in conveying my meaning at first. My efforts met with a stare of surprise, or inextinguishable laughter, but presently a fair-haired little creature seems to grasp my intention, and repeated a name. They had to chatter and explain the business at great length to each other, and my first attempt to make the exquisite little sounds of their language caused an immense amount of amusement. However, I felt like a schoolmaster amidst children, and persisted, and presently I had a score of noun substantives, at least at my command, and then I got to demonstrative pronouns, and even the verb to eat. But it was slow work, and the little people soon tired, and wanted to get away from my interrogations, so I determined rather of necessity to let them give their lessons in little doses when they felt inclined, and very little doses I found they were before long, for I never met people more indolent or more easily fatigued. A queer thing I soon discovered about my little hosts, and that was their lack of interest. They would come to me with eager cries of astonishment, like children, but like children. They would soon stop examining me and wander away after some other toy. The dinner and my conversational beginnings ended, I noted for the first time that almost all those who had surrounded me at first were gone. It is odd too how speedily I came to disregard these little people. I went out through the portal into the sunlit world again. As soon as my hunger was satisfied, I was continually meeting more of these men of the future who would follow me a little distance, chatter and laugh about me, and having smiled and gesticulated in a friendly way, leave me again to my own devices. The calm of evening was upon the world as I emerged from the great hall, and the scene was lit by the warm glow of the setting sun. At first things were very confusing. Everything was so entirely different from the world I had known. Even the flowers, the big building I had left, was situated on the slope of a broad river valley. But the Thames had shifted, perhaps a mile from its present position. I resolved to mount to the summit of a crest, perhaps a mile and a half away, from which I could get a wider view of this, our planet in the year 800 to 1701 had. For that I should explain was the date the little dials of my machine recorded. As I walked, I was watching for every impression that could possibly help to explain the condition of ruinous splendor in which I found the world, for ruinous it was. A little way up the hill, for instance, was a gray heap of granite, bound together by masses of aluminium. A vast labyrinth of precipitous walls and crumpled heaps, amidst which were thick heaps of very beautiful, pagoda-like plants, metals possibly, but wonderfully tinted with brown about the leaves, and incapable of stinging. It was evidently the derelict remains of some vast structure. To what end built I could not determine. It was here that I was destined, at a later date, to have a very strange experience. The first information of a still stranger discovery, but of that I will speak in its proper place, looking around with a sudden thought. From a terrace on which I rested for a while, I realized that there were no small houses to be seen. Apparently, the single house and possibly even the household had vanished here, and there, among the greenery, were palace-like buildings. But the house and the cottage, which form such characteristic features of our own English landscape, had disappeared. Communism, said I to myself, and on the heels of that came another thought. I looked at the half-dozen little figures that were following me. Then in a flash, I perceived that all had the same form of costume, the same soft, hairless visage, and the same girlish rotundity of limb. It may seem strange, perhaps, that I had not noticed this before, but everything was so strange now. I saw the fact plainly enough in costume, and in all the differences of texture and bearing that now mark off the sexes from each other. These people of the future were alike, and the children seemed to my eyes to be but the miniatures of their parents. I judged then that the children of that time were extremely precocious, physically at least, and I found afterwards abundant verification of my opinion. Seeing the ease and security in which these people were living, I felt that this close resemblance of the sexes was, after all, what one would expect for the strength of a man and the softness of a woman, the institution of the family, and the differentiation of occupations are mere militant necessities of an age of physical force. Where population is balanced and abundant, much childbearing becomes an evil. rather than a blessing to the state, where violence comes but rarely, and offspring are secure, there is less necessity. Indeed, there is no necessity for an efficient family and the specialization of the sexes, with reference to their children's needs, disappears. We see some beginnings of this even in our own time. And in this future age it was complete. This, I must remind you, was my speculation at the time. Later I was to appreciate how far it fell short of the reality. While I was musing upon these things, my attention was attracted by a pretty little structure, like a well under a cupola. I thought in a transitory way of the oddness of wells still existing, and then resumed the thread of my speculations. There were no large buildings towards the top of the hill, and as my walking powers were evidently miraculous, I was presently left alone for the first time. With a strange sense of freedom and adventure, I pushed on up to the crest. There I found a seat of some yellow metal that I did not recognize, corroded in places with a kind of pinkish rust, and half smothered in soft moss, the armrests cast, and filed into the resemblance of griffins' heads. I sat down on it, and I surveyed the broad view of our old world, under the sunset of that long day. It was as sweet and fair a view as I have ever seen. The sun had already gone below the horizon, and the west was flaming gold, touched with some horizontal bars of purple and crimson. Below was the valley of the Thames, in which the river lay like a band of burnished steel. I have already spoken of the great palaces, dotted about among the variegated greenery, some in ruins and some still occupied. Here and there rose a white or silvery figure in the waste garden of the earth. Here and there came the sharp, vertical lines of some cupola or obelisk. There were no hedges, no signs of proprietary rights, no evidences of agriculture. The whole earth had become a garden. So watching, I began to put my interpretation upon the things I had seen, and as it shaped itself to me that evening, my interpretation was something in this way. Afterwards I found I had got only a half-truth, or only a glimpse of one facet of the truth. It seemed to me that I had happened upon humanity, upon the wane. The ruddy sunset set me thinking of the sunset of mankind. For the first time I began to realize an odd consequence of the social effort in which we are at present engaged, and yet come to think it is a logical consequence. Enough strength is the outcome of need. Security sets a premium on feebleness. The work of media rating the conditions of life, the true civilizing process that makes life more and more secure, had gone steadily on to a climax. One triumph of a united humanity over nature had followed another. Things that are now mere dreams had become project, deliberately put in hand and carried forward, and the harvest was what I saw. After all, the sanitation and the agriculture of today are still in their rudimentary stage. The science of our time has attacked but a little department of the field of human disease, but even so it spreads its operations very steadily and persistently. Our agriculture and horticulture destroy a weed just here and there and cultivate perhaps a score or so of wholesome plants, leaving the greater number to fight out a balance. As they can, we improve our favorite plants and animals. And how few they are gradually by selective breeding. Now a new and better peach, now a seedless grape, now a sweeter and larger flower, now a more convenient breed of cattle. We improve them gradually, because our ideals are vague and tentative, and our knowledge is very limited, because nature too is shy and slow in our clumsy hands. Someday, all this will be better organized and still better. That is the drift of the current. In spite of the eddies, the whole world will be intelligent, educated and cooperating. Things will move faster and faster towards the subjugation of nature. In the end, wisely and carefully, we shall readjust the balance of animal and vegetable life to suit our human needs. This adjustment, I say, must have been done, and done well done indeed, for all time. In the space of time across which my machine had left, the air was free from gnats, the earth from weeds or fungi. Everywhere were fruits and sweet and delightful flowers. Brilliant butterflies flew hither and thither. The ideal of preventive medicine was attained. Diseases had been stamped out. I saw no evidence of any contagious diseases. During all my stay, and I shall have to tell you later, that even the processes of putrefaction and decay had been profoundly affected by these changes. Social triumphs too had been effected. I saw mankind housed in splendid shelters, gloriously clothed, and as yet I had found them engaged in no toil. There were no signs of struggle, neither social nor economical struggle. The shop, the advertisement traffic, all that commerce, which constitutes the body of our world, was gone. It was natural on that golden evening that I should jump at the idea of a social paradise. The difficulty of increasing population had been met. I guessed, and population had ceased to increase. But with this change in condition comes, inevitably, adaptations to the change. What unless biological science is a mass of errors, is the cause of human intelligence and vigor, hardship and freedom, conditions under which the active, strong and subtle survive, and the weaker go to the wall, conditions that put a premium upon the loyal alliance of capable men, upon self-restraint, patience and decision, and the institution of the family, and the emotions that arise therein, the fierce jealousy, the tenderness for offspring, parental self-devotion, all found their justification and support in the imminent dangers of the young. Now, where are these imminent dangers? There is a sentiment arising, and it will grow, against connubial jealousy, against fierce maternity, against passion of all sorts, unnecessary things now, and things that make us uncomfortable, savage survivals, discords in a refined and pleasant life. I thought of the physical slightness of the people, their lack of intelligence, and those big abundant ruins, and it strengthened my belief in a perfect conquest of nature. For after the battle comes quiet. Humanity had been strong, energetic, and intelligent, and had used all its abundant vitality to alter the conditions under which it lived. And now came the reaction of the altered conditions. Under the new conditions of perfect comfort and security, that restless energy that with us is strength would become weakness. Even in our own time, certain tendencies and desires, once necessary to survival, are a constant source of failure. Physical courage and the love of battle, for instance, are no great help, may even be hindrances to a civilized man. And in a state of physical balance and security, power, intellectual as well as physical, would be out of place. For countless years I judged there had been no danger of war or solitary violence, no danger from wild beasts, no wasting disease to require strength of constitution, no need of toil, for such a life. What we should call the weak are as well equipped as the strong are. Indeed, no longer weak, better equipped indeed they are, for the strong would be fretted by an energy for which there was no outlet. No doubt the exquisite beauty of the buildings I saw was the outcome of the last surgeons of the now purposeless energy of mankind, before it settled down into perfect harmony with the conditions under which it lived. The flourish of that triumph which began the last great peace. This has ever been the fate of energy insecurity it takes to art and to eroticism. And then come langa and decay. Even this artistic impetus would at last die away. Had almost died in that time, I saw, to adorn themselves with flowers, to dance, to sing in the sunlight. So much was left of the artistic spirit, and no more, even that would fade in the end. Into a contented inactivity, we are kept, keen on the grindstone of pain and necessity, and it seemed to me that here was that hateful grindstone, broken at last. As I stood there in the gathering dark, I thought that in this simple explanation, I had mastered the problem of the world. mastered the whole secret of these delicious people, possibly the checks they had devised. For the increase of population had succeeded too well, and their numbers had rather diminished than kept stationary. That would account for the abandoned ruins. Very simple was my explanation, and plausible enough. As most wrong theories are, Chapter 5, as I stood there, musing over this to perfect triumph of man, the full moon yellow and gibbous, came up out of an overflow of silver light in the northeast. The bright little figures ceased to move about below. A noiseless owl flitted by, and I shivered with the chill of the night. I determined to descend and find where I could sleep. I looked for the building I knew, then my eye traveled along to the figure of the white sphinx, upon the pedestal of bronze, growing distinct. As the light of the rising moon grew brighter, I could see the silver birch against it. There was the tangle of rhododendron bushes, black in the pale light, and there was the little lawn. I looked at the lawn again. A queer doubt chilled my complacency. No, said I stantly to myself. That was not the lawn, but it was the lawn. For the white leprous face of the Sphinx was towards it. Can you imagine what I felt as this conviction came home to me? But you cannot. The time machine was gone at once. Like a lash across the face came the possibility of losing my own age, of being left helpless in this strange new world. The bare thought of it was an actual physical sensation. I could feel it grip me at the throat and stop my breathing in another moment. I was in a passion of fear and running with great leaping strides down the slope. Once I fell headlong and cut my face. I lost no time in stanching the blood, but jumped up and ran on, with a warm trickle down my cheek and chin. All the time I ran, I was saying to myself, they have moved it a little, pushed it under the bushes out of the way. Nevertheless, I ran with all my might, all the time with the certainty that sometimes comes with excessive dread. I knew that such assurance was fully, knew instinctively, that the machine was removed out of my reach. My breath came with pain. I suppose I covered the whole distance, from the hill crest to the little lawn, 2 miles perhaps in 10 minutes. And I am not a young man, I cursed aloud as I ran, at my confident folly in leaving the machine. Wasting good breath thereby, I cried aloud and none answered. Not a creature seemed to be stirring in that moonlit world. When I reached the lawn, my worst fears were realized. Not a trace of the thing was to be seen. I felt faint and cold when I faced the empty space. Among the black tangle of bushes, I ran round it furiously, as if the thing might be hidden in a corner, and then stopped abruptly, with my hands clutching my hair. Above me towered the Sphinx upon the bronze pedestal. White shining leprous in the light of the rising moon. It seemed to smile in mockery of my dismay. I might have consoled myself by imagining the little people had put the mechanism in some shelter. For me, had I not felt assured of their physical and intellectual inadequacy, that is what dismayed me. The sense of some hitherto unsuspected power, through whose intervention my invention had vanished. Yet for one thing I felt assured. Unless some other age had produced its exact duplicate, the machine could not have moved in time. The attachment of the levers, I will show you the method later, prevented anyone from tampering with it in that way. When they were removed, it had moved and was hid only in space. But then, where could it be? I think I must have had a kind of frenzy. I remember running violently, in and out among the moonlit bushes, all round the swings, and startling some white animal that in the dim light I took for a small deer. I remember, too late that night, beating the bush with my clenched fist, until my knuckles were gashed and bleeding from the broken twigs. Then sobbing and raving in my anguish of mind, I went down to the great building of stone. The big hall was dark, silent, and deserted. I slipped on the uneven floor and fell over one of the malachite tables. Almost breaking my shin, they lit a match and went on past the dusty curtains, of which I've told you. There I found a second great hall covered with cushions, upon which perhaps a score or so of the little people were sleeping. I have no doubt they found my second appearance strange enough, coming suddenly out of the quiet darkness, with inarticulate noises and the splatter and flare of a match, for they had forgotten about matches. "Where's my time machine?" I began bawling like an angry child, laying hands upon them and shaking them up together. It must have been very clear to them. Some laughed, most of them looked sorely frightened. When I saw them standing around me, it came into my head that I was doing as foolish a thing as it was possible for me to do under the circumstances, in trying to revive the sensation of fear for reasoning from their daylight behavior. I thought that fear must be forgotten. Abruptly I dashed down the match, and knocking one of the people over in my course, went blundering across the big dining hall again. Out under the moonlight I heard cries of terror, and their little feet running and stumbling this way and that. I do not remember all I did as the moon crept up the sky. I suppose it was the unexpected nature of my loss that maddened me. I felt hopelessly cut off from my own kind, a strange animal in an unknown world. I must have raved to and froze, screaming and crying upon God and fate. Now have a memory of horrible fatigue, as the long night of despair wore away, of looking in this impossible place, and that of grouping among moonlit ruins and touching strange creatures in the black shadows, at last of lying on the ground near the Sphinx, and weeping with absolute wretchedness. I had nothing left but misery. Then I slept, and when I woke again, it was full day, and a couple of sparrows were hopping round me. On the turf within reach of my arm, I sat up in the freshness of the morning, trying to remember how I had got there and why. I had such a profound sense of desertion and despair. Then things came clear in my mind, with the plain reasonable daylight. I could look my circumstances fairly in the face. I saw the wild folly of my frenzy overnight, and I could reason with myself. Suppose the worst, I said. Suppose the machine altogether lost, perhaps destroyed. It behoves me to be calm and patient, to learn the way of the people, to get a clear idea of the method of my loss, and the means of getting materials and tools, so that in the end perhaps I may make another. That would be my only hope. Perhaps, but better than despair. And after all, it was a beautiful and curious world. But probably the machine had only been taken away. Still, I must be calm and patient, find its hiding place, and recover it by force or cunning. And with that, I scrambled to my feet and looked about me, wondering where I could bathe. I felt weary, stiff, and travel-soiled. The freshness of the morning made me desire an equal freshness. I had exhausted my emotion. Indeed, as I went about my business, I found myself wondering at my intense excitement. Overnight, I made a careful examination of the ground. About the little lawn, I wasted some time in futile questionings, conveyed as well as I was able to, such of the little people as came by. They all failed to understand my gestures. Some were simply stalled. Some thought it was a jest and laughed at me. I had the hardest task in the world, to keep my hands off their pretty laughing faces. It was a foolish impulse, but the devil, begotten of fear and blind anger, was ill-curved and still eager to take advantage of my publicity. The turf gave better counsel. I found a groove ripped in it, about midway between the pedestal of the swings, and the marks of my feet were on arrival. I had struggled with the overturned machine. There were other signs of removal, about with queer narrow footprints, like those I could imagine made by a sloth. This directed my closer attention to the pedestal. It was as I think I have said. Of bronze, it was not a mere block, but highly decorated, with deep-framed panels on either side. I went and rapped at these. The pedestal was hollow, Examining the panels with care, I found them discontinuous with the frames. There were no handles or keyholes. But possibly the panels, if they were doors. As I supposed open from within, one thing was clear enough to my mind. It took no very great mental effort to infer that my time machine was inside that pedestal. But how it got there was a different problem. I saw the heads of two orange cloud people coming through the bushes and under some blossom-covered apple trees towards me. I turned smiling to them and beckoned them to me. They came, and then pointing to the bronze pedestal, I tried to intimate my wish to open it. But at my first gesture towards this, they behaved very oddly. I don't know how to convey their expression to you. Suppose you were to use a grossly improper gesture. To a delicate-minded woman, it is how she would look. They went off, as if they had received the last possible insult. I tried a sweet-looking little chap in white next, with exactly the same result. Somehow his manner made me feel ashamed of myself. But as you know, I wanted the time machine. And I tried him once more, as he turned off like the others. My temper got the better of me. In 3 strides, I was after him, had him by the loose part of his robe around the neck, and began dragging him towards the Sphinx. Then I saw the horror and repugnance of his face, and all of a sudden I let him go. But I was not beaten yet. I banged with my fist at the bronze panels. I thought I heard something stir inside. To be explicit, I thought I heard a sound like a chuckle, but I must have been mistaken. Then I got a big pebble from the river and came and hammered, till I had flattened a coil in the decorations, and the verdigris came off in powdery flakes. The delicate little people must have heard me hammering. In gusty outbreaks a mile away on either hand. But nothing came of it. I saw a crowd of them upon the slopes, looking furtively at me at last. Hot and tired, I sat down to watch the place. But I was too restless to watch long. I am too occidental for a long vigil. I could work at a problem for years, but to wait inactive for 24 hours, that is another matter. I got up after a time and began walking aimlessly through the bushes towards the hill again. Patience, said I to myself. If you want your machine again, you must leave that Sphinx alone. If they mean to take your machine away, it's little good you're wrecking their bronze panels. And if they don't, you will get it back as soon as you can ask for it. To sit among all those unknown things before a puzzle like that is hopeless. That way lies monomania. Face this world, learn its ways. Watch it, be careful of too hasty guesses at its meaning. In the end you will find clues to it all. Then suddenly, the humor of the situation came into my mind. The thought of the years I had spent in study and toil to get into the future age, and now my passion of anxiety to get out of it. I had made myself the most complicated and the most hopeless trap that ever a man devised. Although it was at my own expense, I could not help myself. I laughed loud going through the big palace. It seemed to me that the little people avoided me. It may have been my fancy, or it may have had something to do with my hammering at the gates of bronze, yet I felt tolerably sure of the avoidance. I was careful, however, to show no concern, and to abstain from any pursuit of them. And in the course of a day or two, things got back to the old footing. I made what progress I could in the language, and in addition I pushed my explorations here and there. Either I missed some subtle point, or their language was excessively simple, almost exclusively composed of concrete substantives and verbs. There seemed to be few, if any, abstract terms or little use of figurative language. Their sentences were usually simple and of 2 words, and I failed to convey or understand any but the simplest propositions. I determined to put the thought of my time machine and the mystery of the bronze doors under the Sphinx as much as possible in a corner of memory until my growing knowledge would lead me back to them. In a natural way, yet a certain feeling you may understand, tethered me in a circle of a few miles round the point of my arrival, so far as I could see all the world displayed the same exuberant richness as the Thames Valley. From every hill I climbed, I saw the same abundance of splendid buildings, endlessly varied in material and style, the same clustering thickets of evergreens, the same blossom-laden trees and tree ferns. Here and there water shone like silver, and beyond the land rose into blue, undulating hills. And so faded into the serenity of the sky, a peculiar feature, which presently attracted my attention, was the presence of certain circular wells. Several, as it seemed to me, of a very great depth. One lay by the path up the hill, which I had followed during my first walk. Like the others, it was rimmed with bronze, curiously wrought, and protected by a little cupola from the rain. Sitting by the side of these wells, and peering down into the shafted darkness, I could see no gleam of water, nor could I start any reflection with a lighted match. But in all of them I heard a certain sound. A thud, 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 like the beating of some big engine, and I discovered from the flaring of my matches that a steady current of air set down the shafts. Further, I threw a scrap of paper into the throat of one, and instead of fluttering slowly down, it was at once sucked swiftly out of sight. After a time, too, I came to connect these wells with tall towers, standing here and there upon the slopes, for above them there was often just a flicker in the air, as one sees on a hot day above a sun-scorched beach. Putting things together, I'd reached a strong suggestion of an extensive system of subterranean ventilation, whose true import it was difficult to imagine. I was at first inclined to associate it with the sanitary apparatus of these people. It was an obvious conclusion, but it was absolutely wrong, and here I must admit that I learned very little of drains, and bells and modes of conveyance, and the like conveniences during my time in this real future. In some of these visions of utopias and coming times, which I have read, there is a vast amount of detail about building and social arrangements and so forth. But while such details are easy enough to obtain, when the whole world is contained in one's imagination, they are altogether inaccessible to a real traveler. Amid such realities as I found here, conceived the tale of London, which a Negro, fresh from Central Africa, would take back to his tribe. What would he know of railway companies, of social movements, of telephone and telegraph wires, of the parcels delivery company and postal orders and the like? Yet we at least should be willing enough to explain these things to him. And even of what he knew, how much could he make his untraveled friend either apprehend or believe? Then think how narrow the gap between a Negro and a white man of our own times, and how wide the interval between myself and these of the golden age. I was sensible of much which was unseen, and which contributed to my comfort, but save for a general impression of automatic organization, I fear I can convey very little of the difference to your mind in the matter of sepulture. For instance, I could see no signs of crematoria, nor anything suggestive of tombs, but it occurred to me that possibly there might be cemeteries or crematories somewhere beyond the range of my explorings. This again was a question I deliberately put to myself, and my curiosity was at first entirely defeated. Upon the point the thing puzzled me, and I was led to make a further remark, which puzzled me still more, that aged and infirm among this people there were none. I must confess that my satisfaction with my first theories of an automatic civilization and a decadent humanity did not long endure. Yet I could think of no other. Let me put my difficulties. The several big palaces I had explored were mere living places, great dining halls and sleeping apartments. I could find no machinery, no appliances of any kind, yet these people were clothed in pleasant fabrics that must at times need renewal, and their sandals, though undecorated, were fairly complex specimens of metalwork. Somehow such things must be made, and the little people displayed no vestige of a creative tendency. There were no shops, no workshops, no sign of importations among them. They spent all their time in playing gently, in bathing in the river, in making love in a half-playful fashion, in eating fruit and sleeping. I could not see how things were kept going. Then again about the time machine. Something I knew not what had taken it into the hollow pedestal of the White Sphinx. Why, for the life of me, I could not imagine those waterless wells too. Those flickering pillars, I felt I lacked a clue. I felt, how shall I put it, suppose you found an inscription, with sentences here and there, in excellent plain English, and interpolated there with others made up of words, of letters, even absolutely unknown to you. Well, on the third day of my visit, that was how the world of 800 to 1701 presented itself to me. That day too, I made a friend of a sort. It happened that as I was watching some of the little people bathing in a shallow, one of them was seized with cramp and began drifting downstream. The main current ran rather swiftly, but not too strongly for even a moderate swimmer. It will give you an idea, therefore, of the strange deficiency in these creatures when I tell you that none made the slightest attempt to rescue the weakly, crying little thing which was drowning before their eyes. When I realized this, I hurriedly slipped off my clothes and, wading in at a point lower down, I caught the poor mite and drew her safe to land. A little rubbing of the limbs soon brought her round, and I had the satisfaction of seeing she was all right. Before I left her, I had got to such a low estimate of her kind that I did not expect any gratitude from her. In that, however, I was wrong. This happened in the morning. In the afternoon, I met my little woman, as I believe it was, as I was returning towards my center from an exploration, and she received me with cries of delight and presented me with a big garland of flowers, evidently made for me and me alone. The thing took my imagination. Very possibly I've been feeling desolate. At any rate, I did my best to display my appreciation of the gift. We were soon seated together in a little stone arbor, engaged in conversation chiefly of smiles. The creature's friendliness affected me, exactly as a child's might have done. We passed each other flowers and she kissed my hands. I did the same to hers. Then I tried talk and found that her name was Wiener, which, though I don't know what it meant, somehow seemed appropriate enough. That was the beginning of a queer friendship, which lasted a week and ended, as I will tell you. She was exactly like a child. She wanted to be with me always. She tried to follow me everywhere, and on my next journey out and about. It went to my heart to tie her down and leave her, at last, exhausted and calling after me rather plaintively. But the problems of the world had to be mastered. I had not, I said to myself, come into the future to carry on a miniature flirtation. Yet her distress when I left her was very great. Her expostulations of the parting was sometimes frantic, and I think altogether I had as much trouble as comfort from her devotion. Nevertheless, she was somehow a very great comfort. I thought it was mere childish affection that made her cling to me. Until it was too late, I did not clearly know what I had inflicted upon her when I left her, nor until it was too late did I clearly understand what she was to me. For by merely seeming fond of me and showing in her weak, futile way that she cared for me, the little doll of a creature, presently gave my return to the neighborhood of the White Sphinx almost the feeling of coming home, and I would watch for her tiny figure of white and gold. So soon as I came over the hill, it was from her too that I learned that fear had not yet left the world. She was fearless enough in the daylight, and she had the oddest confidence in me. For once in a foolish moment, I made threatening grimaces at her, and she simply laughed at them. But she dreaded the dark, dreaded shadows, dreaded black things. Darkness to her was the one thing dreadful. It was a singularly passionate emotion, and it set me thinking and observing. I discovered that, among other things, that these little people gathered into the great houses after dark and slept in droves. To enter upon them without a light was to put them into a tumult of apprehension. I never found one out of doors, or one sleeping alone with indoors after dark. Yet I was still such a blockhead that I missed the lesson of that fear, and in spite of Wiener's distress, I insisted upon sleeping away from these slumbering multitudes. It troubled her greatly, but in the end her odd affection for me triumphed, and for 5 of the nights of our acquaintance, including the last night of all, she slept with her head pillowed on my arm. But my story slips away from me as I speak of her. It must have been the night before her rescue that I was awakened about dawn. I had been restless, dreaming most disagreeably that I was drowned, and that seeing enemies were feeling over my face. With their soft palps I woke with a start, and with an odd fancy that some grayish animal had just rushed out of the chamber. I tried to get to sleep again, but I felt restless and uncomfortable. It was that dim gray hour when things are just creeping out of darkness, when everything is colorless and clear-cut and yet unreal. I got up and went down into the great hall, and so out upon the flagstones in front of the palace. I thought I would make a virtue of necessity and see the sunrise. The moon was setting, and the dying moonlight and the first pallor of dawn were mingled in a ghastly half-light. The bushes were inky black, the ground a somber gray, the sky colorless and cheerless. And up the hill I thought I could see ghosts there. Several times as I scanned the slope, I saw white figures twice. I fancied I saw a solitary, white ape-like creature running rather quickly up the hill, and once near the ruins, I saw a leash of them carrying some dark body. They moved hastily. I did not see what became of them. It seemed that they vanished among the bushes. The dawn was still indistinct. You must understand, I was feeling that chill, uncertain early morning feeling you may have known. I doubted my eyes as the eastern sky grew brighter, and the light of the day came on, and its vivid coloring returned upon the world. Once more, I scanned the view keenly, but I saw no vestige of my white figures. They were mere creatures of the half-light. They must have been ghosts, I said. I wonder whence they dated, for a queer notion of Grand Allen's came into my head, and amused me. If each generation die and leave ghosts, he argued, the world at last will get overcrowded with them. On that theory they would have grown innumerable, some 800,000 years hence. And it was no great wonder to see for it once, but the jest was unsatisfying, and I was thinking of these figures all the morning, until Wiener's rescue drove them out of my head. I associated them in some indefinite way with the white animal I had startled in my first passionate search for the time machine. But Wiener was a pleasant substitute, it all the same. They were soon destined to take far deadlier possession of my mind. I think I have said how much hotter than our own was the weather of this golden age. I cannot account for it. It may be that the sun was hotter, or the earth nearer the sun. It is usual to assume that the sun will go on cooling steadily in the future, but people unfamiliar with such speculations as those of the younger Darwin forget that the planets must ultimately fall back, one by one, into the parent body. As these catastrophes occur, the sun will blaze with renewed energy, and it may be that some inner planet had suffered this fate. Whatever the reason, the fact remains that the sun was very much hotter than we know it well. One very hot morning, my 4th, I think, As I was seeking shelter from the heat and glare, in a colossal ruin near the great house, where I slept and fed, there happened this strange thing. Clambering among these heaps of masonry, I found a narrow gallery, whose end and side windows were blocked by fallen masses of stone, by contrast with the brilliancy outside. It seemed at first impenetrably dark to me. I entered it, groping for the change from light to blackness, made spots of color swim before me. Suddenly I halted spellbound. A pair of eyes, luminous by reflection against the daylight without, was watching me out of the darkness. The old instinctive dread of wild beasts came upon me. I clenched my hands and steadfastly looked into the glaring eyeballs. I was afraid to turn. Then the thought of the absolute security in which humanity appeared to be living came to my mind, and then I remembered that strange terror of the dark, overcoming my fear to some extent. I advanced a step and spoke. I would admit that my voice was harsh and ill-controlled. I put out my hand and touched something soft. At once the eyes darted sideways, and something white ran past me. I turned with my heart in my mouth and saw a queer, little ape-like figure, its head held down in a peculiar manner. Running across the sunlit space behind me, it blundered against a block of granite, staggered aside, and in a moment was hidden in a black shadow. Beneath another pile of ruined masonry, my impression of it is of course imperfect, but I know it was a dull white and had strange, large grayish-red eyes also, that there was flaxen hair on its head and down its back, but as I say, it went too fast for me to see distinctly. I cannot even say whether it ran on all fours, or only with its forearms held very low. After an instant's pause, I followed it into the second heap of ruins. I could not find it at first, but after a time, in the profound obscurity, I came upon one of those round, well-like openings of which I have told you, half closed by a fallen pillar. A sudden thought came to me. Could this thing have vanished down the shaft? I lit a match, and looking down, I saw a small white moving creature with large, bright eyes, which regarded me steadfastly as it retreated. It made me shudder. It was so like a human spider. It was clambering down the wall, and now I saw for the first time a number of metal foot and hand rests, forming a kind of ladder down the shaft. Kakangcho la mt kwak en tren, makan la mt by hcc via long dung cm va ss keen trine.